The setting sun cast long shadows across the arid New Mexico landscape as Martha Coleman knelt in the dry earth, her fingers working methodically to set the last tripwire. Her movements were practiced and precise despite the 6-month swell of her belly that forced her to adjust her balance. The mechanism was simple but effective. A thin wire stretched across the path leading to her ranch, connected to an old shotgun mounted behind a stack of firewood. Not meant to kill, just to warn. Martha paused, wiping sweat from her brow, with the back of her hand leaving a streak of dirt across her forehead. At 35, her face carried both strength and sorrow in equal measure, deep lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and tears, skin tanned and weathered from years under the southwestern sun. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, with a few stubborn strands that had escaped to frame her face. As she worked, her ears remained attuned to the sounds around her, the whisper of wind through the mesquite, the distant call of a coyote, and something else, something that didn't belong. Martha froze her hand, instinctively moving to the Winchester rifle that never left her side these days. Hoofbeats, distant but approaching. She rose slowly, one hand supporting her lower back, the other gripping the rifle. The baby kicked inside her as if sensing her tension. "It's all right," she whispered, more to herself than to the child. "We're ready for them." Martha's eyes drifted to the small wooden cross visible on the hill behind her ranch house, a simple marker for a man whose life had been anything but simple. The memories came unbidden, as vivid as if they were happening to her all over again. 1 year earlier, the autumn air carried a pleasant crispness as Thomas Coleman stood on the porch of their modest ranch house, tall and steady as the mountains in the distance. His face was weathered, but kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled at Martha. Clayton Reynolds came by again. He said, his voice carrying that quiet determination she'd always loved. "Offered twice what we paid for the land." Martha frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's the third time this month. And he'll get the same answer as before." Thomas stepped closer, placing his hands on her shoulders. "This land is our future, Martha. Our legacy." She nodded, leaning into his touch. After 10 years of marriage, they'd finally saved enough to buy this small plot by the Rio Grande. Not the biggest or the most fertile, but it was theirs. And now, with a baby finally on the way after years of trying the land, meant even more. What they couldn't have known then was that Clayton Reynolds, owner of the sprawling Double R ranch that surrounded their property on 3 sides, didn't take rejection well. What they couldn't have known was that his son Carter had been watching from the ridge when Thomas refused the offer one final time. The memory shifted, blurring into the worst day of Martha's life. She'd been hanging laundry when she heard the voices, Thomas and Clayton, their words indistinct but their tones clear. Arguing. She'd rounded the corner of the house just in time to see Carter Reynolds emerge from behind his father, revolver drawn. "Thomas," she'd screamed. Her husband had turned, reaching for his own weapon, but he was too late. The shot echoed across the valley, and Thomas staggered backward. Martha ran to him as he fell, catching him, lowering him gently to the ground. Blood bloomed across his chest like a terrible flower. "Martha," he'd whispered, his eyes already growing distant. "The land. Our child." Clayton and Carter had ridden away without a backward glance, leaving her clutching her dying husband, her screams carrying across the empty land with no one to hear. Present day, Martha blinked back to the present, her jaw set in grim determination. After Thomas died, she discovered she was pregnant, a miracle, and a burden all at once. The town doctor had suggested she sell the ranch and move back east to family, but Martha had refused. This land was all she had left of Thomas, the only inheritance she could give their child. She picked up her husband's Winchester, her Winchester now, and checked that it was loaded. Clayton Reynolds had tried to force her out through legal channels, claiming Thomas had owed him money, but Martha had stood her ground. Then had come the threats, the accidents near her property, a fence cut here, cattle scattered there. The hoofbeats grew louder. Martha moved toward the house, keeping to the shadows. She wouldn't fire first, but she would be ready. As she reached the porch, the baby kicked again, harder this time. Martha placed a hand on her belly. "Your daddy died protecting this land," she whispered. "And I swear on his grave, no one's going to take it from us." The sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire. Martha Coleman stood watch, a solitary sentinel in a darkening world, waiting for whatever would come next. 3 days later, as dusk settled over the land, Martha made her way down to the Rio Grande with a wooden bucket in one hand and her Winchester in the other. The drought had been particularly harsh this year, drying up the small creek that normally supplied her ranch. The river was a longer walk, but necessary. Both she and her livestock needed water to survive. Her steps were careful as she navigated the rocky path that wound down to the riverbank. The baby made her ungainly, and the last thing she needed was a fallout here alone. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, turning the river into a ribbon of liquid gold. Martha knelt at the river's edge, setting her rifle within easy reach. As she dipped the bucket into the cool water, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, that prickling sensation of being watched. She remained still, keeping her movements smooth as she continued filling the bucket. Her eyes scanned the opposite bank, the rocky outcroppings, the dense stands of mesquite. Nothing moved yet, the feeling persisted. The snap of a twig behind her was all the warning she needed. Martha grabbed her Winchester and turned in one fluid motion, bringing the weapon to bear, even as water sloshed from the bucket onto her worn boots. Well, look who's out all alone. Carter Reynolds emerged from the shadow of a large boulder flanked by two men Martha recognized as hands from the Double R Ranch. Carter was tall like his father, but where Clayton carried his authority with a kind of cold dignity, the son wore his power like an ill-fitting suit, all swagger and menace. "You're on my property, Carter," Martha said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. Carter laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. "Actually, we're on public land. The river belongs to everyone." He took a step closer, his gaze dropping to her swollen belly. "You know my offer still stands. A woman in your condition shouldn't be alone. As my wife, you'd want for nothing." Martha's grip tightened on her rifle. "I'd rather marry a rattlesnake." The smile fell from Carter's face. "You've been turning down my proposals for months, making me look bad." He nodded to his companions, who began to spread out, moving to flank her. "Maybe it's time you learned some respect." Martha raised her rifle higher. "Take one more step, and I'll put a hole in you big enough to see daylight through." "3 against 1, Carter said, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "And in your condition, not good odds, Martha." She knew he was right. Even if she managed to take down Carter, his men would get her. But Martha Coleman wasn't about to show fear, not to the son of the man who'd murdered her husband. "I like my chances just fine," she said. Carter's face darkened. He nodded to one of his men, who lunged forward to grab the rifle. Martha stepped back, her foot slipping on the muddy riverbank. She managed to keep her balance, but the sudden movement sent a sharp pain through her abdomen. The baby. Time seemed to slow as Carter drew his revolver. Martha brought the Winchester up, knowing she wouldn't be fast enough. The whistle of the arrow cut through the tension like a knife. It struck the ground at Carter's feet, quivering in the earth less than an inch from his boot. Everyone froze. "The next one goes through your heart." The voice came from above them, clear and commanding. All eyes turned to the rock formation that overlooked the river. There, silhouetted against the darkening sky, stood a man unlike any Martha had seen in these parts. Tall and powerfully built, he stood with the stillness of someone entirely comfortable in his own skin. His long black hair was tied back with a leather thong, revealing sharp features and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a mix of traditional Apache clothing and what looked like cavalry trousers, with a knife at his belt and a bow drawn and ready in his hands. "An Apache," one of Carter's men hissed, his hand moving toward his gun. "I wouldn't," the stranger said, drawing back the bowstring another inch. Carter's face flushed with anger, but there was fear there too. Martha could see it in the way his eyes darted between the stranger and the arrow at his feet. "This isn't your business, Indian," Carter said, his voice higher than usual. "You threaten a woman with child," the stranger replied calmly. "That makes it my business." For a long moment no one moved. The only sound was the gentle rushing of the river and the call of a distant bird. Then Carter slowly holstered his weapon. "This isn't over, Martha," he said, backing away. "Not by a long shot." He glanced up at the Apache. "And you'd better watch your back. Indians who cause trouble don't last long around here." The stranger didn't respond, his bow remaining drawn until Carter and his men had mounted their horses and ridden away. Only then did he lower the weapon, his gaze shifting to Martha. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his English perfect, but with a slight accent she couldn't place. Martha shook her head, her hand moving to her belly where the pain had been. It was gone now. The baby settled once more. "No, thank you." The stranger descended from the rocks with a grace that spoke of a lifetime navigating such terrain. Up close, Martha could see he was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 40, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a few strands of gray in his black hair. You shouldn't be out here alone, he said, retrieving his arrow from the ground. I don't have much choice, Martha replied, bending to pick up her bucket. The water had mostly spilled, but there was enough for now. The creek on my property's dried up. The stranger studied her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable. I'll walk with you. Martha hesitated. Common sense told her to be wary of a strange man, especially an Apache. The newspapers were full of stories about raids and violence. But this man had just saved her from Carter Reynolds, and something in his manner put her at ease. I'm Martha Coleman, she said, offering her name as both greeting and acceptance. The people call me Swift Shadow, he replied. Then, seeming to recognize this might sound strange to her ears, he added, Joseph is my Christian name, but few use it. Martha nodded. Swift Shadow it is then. They walked in silence for a time, Martha carrying her bucket, Swift Shadow moving slightly ahead, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. His steps were so quiet that sometimes Martha had to glance over to confirm he was still there. You know who they were? He asked eventually. Carter Reynolds and some of his father's men, Martha answered. Clayton Reynolds owns the Double R Ranch, most of the land around here. Not your land. It wasn't a question, but Martha answered anyway. No, not my land. They reached the edge of her property marked by a simple wooden fence that had seen better days. Martha's ranch was modest, a small adobe house, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, a corral with a few horses and fields that had once been planted with corn but now lay fallow. Swift Shadow stopped at the fence line, his gaze taking in the property. You live here alone? Martha set down her bucket, stretching her back. I do now. My husband Thomas was killed a year ago. She didn't elaborate, but something in Swift Shadow's expression suggested he understood. The child's father, he said, nodding toward her belly. Yes. Martha picked up the bucket again. Thank you for your help today. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Swift Shadow looked back in the direction they'd come. They will return, with more men next time. Martha knew he was right. Carter's pride wouldn't let this go, and Clayton was unlikely to rein in his son. Then I'll be ready. A hint of what might have been respect flickered across Swift Shadow's face. You are brave, Martha Coleman, but courage alone will not stop bullets. Before she could respond, he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small bundle of dried herbs. For the child, he said, holding it out to her. My people use it to give strength to mothers and their unborn. Martha took the offering, surprised. Thank you. Swift Shadow nodded once, then turned to go. Wait, Martha called after him. Why did you help me? He paused, looking back over his shoulder. There was something in his eyes, then a shadow of old pain quickly masked. I made a promise, he said simply. Before she could ask what he meant, Swift Shadow melted into the gathering darkness, leaving Martha alone with her bucket of river water and more questions than answers. Martha woke before dawn, as had become her habit since Thomas's death. The ranch wouldn't run itself, and there were always more chores than hours in the day. She eased herself out of bed, one hand automatically going to her lower back to support the weight of her growing child. The small adobe house was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the dying fire in the hearth. Martha stoked the embers and added another log, waiting for the flames to catch before heading to the kitchen. She put coffee on to boil one of her few remaining luxuries and moved to the window to watch the darkness give way to the first pale streaks of dawn. Her encounter with Carter Reynolds and Swift Shadow the previous evening had left her unsettled. Carter's threats weren't new, but the intensity in his eyes had been. And Swift Shadow, she couldn't make sense of him. An Apache warrior who spoke perfect English, who carried himself with dignity, but seemed haunted by something. And what had he meant about a promise? The coffee began to bubble, drawing Martha back to the present. She poured herself a cup and took a sip of the strong, bitter liquid, letting it warm her from the inside. As the sky lightened, she finished her morning routine, washing, dressing, and preparing for the day ahead. By the time she stepped outside, the sun was just peeking over the eastern horizon, bathing the landscape in a soft golden glow. Martha paused on the porch, taking a moment to appreciate the beauty of the land that was hers. The mountains in the distance, their peaks tinged pink with the dawn light. The Rio Grande winding its way through the valley below. The mesquite and creosote that dotted the hillsides. It wasn't the most fertile land, nor the easiest to farm, but it was hers, and the child's. Their home, their future. The sound of approaching hoofbeats snapped Martha from her reverie. She tensed her hand, moving toward the Winchester that leaned against the doorframe. But it was just one rider moving at a leisurely pace. As the figure came into view, Martha relaxed slightly. It was Ezra Sullivan, former sheriff of the nearby town of Rio Blanco, and one of the few people she still considered a friend. At 72, Ezra was still a commanding presence, tall and straight-backed, despite his years with a shock of white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He'd been a friend of Thomas's father and had known Martha since she first arrived in New Mexico as a young bride. "Morning, Martha," Ezra called as he dismounted, his movements, still spry for a man his age. "Thought I'd ride out and check on you." "Good morning, Ezra," Martha replied, smiling despite herself. "Coffee's hot if you want some." "Wouldn't say no to that." He tied his horse to the hitching post and climbed the steps to the porch, his shrewd blue eyes taking in the tripwire Martha had set the day before. "Expecting trouble." Martha's smile faded. "Had some yesterday. Carter Reynolds and two of his father's men caught me down at the river." Ezra's expression darkened. "You hurt?" "No," someone intervened. She hesitated, unsure how Ezra would react to the next part. "An Apache. Called himself Swift Shadow." To her surprise, Ezra showed no shock, merely raising an eyebrow. "Tall fellow carries himself like he's been in a war." Martha nodded, surprise. "You know him?" "Of him," Ezra corrected, following her into the house. "He's Chiricahua Apache. Been living in these parts for a few years now. Mostly keeps to himself. Folks in town say he used to scout for the army, but something happened. Never heard the full story." Martha poured him a cup of coffee, her mind turning over this new information. "He said he helped me because of a promise he made." Ezra accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, his brow furrowing. "Promise to who?" He didn't say. Martha sat across from him at the small kitchen table, easing herself into the chair. "But he knew I was a widow." Ezra sipped his coffee, thoughtful. "Strange business." He set the cup down, his expression serious. "Martha, I didn't just come to check on you. I've been hearing things in town. Clayton Reynolds has been putting pressure on the bank about your mortgage." Martha's stomach tightened. After Thomas died, she'd fallen behind on payments, using what little savings they had to keep the ranch running. "I'm only a month late." "It's not about the money," Ezra said. "Reynolds wants your land, and he's not particular about how he gets it." "But why?" Martha asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "It's not the best land around. Why is he so determined to have it?" Ezra leaned forward. "Word is the railroad's planning a new spur line through the territory. The survey crew's been working south of here. If the line comes through, land values will triple overnight." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "And Clayton wants to make sure he controls as much land as possible along the route." "That'd be my guess." Ezra nodded. "But there's more. There's been talk about water rights. This drought's hit everyone hard, but your property's held up better than most. Some folks think you might be sitting on a natural spring or an underground water source." Martha thought of the small creek on her property, usually reliable, even in dry years, though this season it had finally succumbed to the drought. Thomas had once mentioned that his father believed there was an ancient aquifer beneath their land, but they'd never had the money to drill and find out. "So Clayton wants my land for the railroad and the water," Martha said, her voice hardening. "Well, he's not getting it. This land is all I have left to give my child." Ezra reached across the table, his weathered hand covering hers. "I know, Martha, and I'll help however I can. But be careful. Clayton Reynolds didn't get where he is by playing fair." They finished their coffee in thoughtful silence. As Ezra was preparing to leave, Martha remembered the herbs Swift Shadow had given her. "Ezra, do you know anything about Apache medicine?" she asked, showing him the small bundle. The old sheriff examined it, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Looks like what the native women use for expectant mothers. My late wife, God rest her soul, used something similar when she was carrying our son." "Where'd you get it?" "Swift Shadow gave it to me, said it was for strength." Ezra handed it back, a strange expression on his face. "Interesting, the Apache don't usually share their medicine with outsiders." He put on his hat, adjusting it against the sun. "You be careful, Martha, and send word if you need anything." After Ezra left, Martha went about her morning chores, feeding the horses, checking the chicken coop, and assessing the vegetable garden that was struggling in the dry earth. All the while, her mind turned over the information about Clayton Reynolds and the railroad. It was mid-morning when she sensed, rather than heard, someone approaching. Martha turned, half expecting to see Swift Shadow, but it was a different man entirely. He was young, perhaps 30, with sandy hair and a neat appearance that spoke of town life rather than ranch work. He rode a well-groomed bay horse and wore a suit despite the heat, though he'd removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves in concession to the temperature. "Mrs. Coleman," he called, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm Samuel Holloway from the First Bank of Rio Blanco." Martha's guard went up immediately. "What can I do for you, Mr. Holloway?" "I've come about your mortgage," he said, dismounting. Up close, Martha could see he was nervous, constantly adjusting his spectacles. "There's been some concern about the late payment." "I'm only a month behind," Martha said, repeating what she told Ezra. "The agreement gives me a grace period of 3 months before any action can be taken." Samuel Holloway shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, that's normally the case. But Mr. Reynolds has spoken to the bank president, and there's some concern about the viability of your operation given your situation." His eyes flicked to her pregnant belly and then away. Anger flared in Martha's chest. "My situation doesn't affect my ability to run this ranch, Mr. Holloway, and the terms of my mortgage are clear." "I understand," he said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "And I personally agree with you. But Mr. Reynolds is the bank's largest customer, and his influence is substantial." Martha studied the young banker. Despite his nervousness, there was something forthright in his manner that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his mission. "Are you here to foreclose Mr. Holloway?" she asked directly. "No," he said, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Not yet, but I felt you should know that Mr. Reynolds is pushing for it. He suggested that the bank might need to reevaluate the risk of your loan." "I see." Martha's voice was cool. "And is there anything else I should know?" Samuel hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might be listening. "Just be careful, Mrs. Coleman. Clayton Reynolds doesn't take no for an answer, and there are rumors that some of the documents related to land ownership in this area aren't entirely legitimate." Before Martha could ask what he meant, the banker was mounting his horse again. "I'll do what I can at the bank," he said, "but I can't promise anything." Martha watched him ride away, her mind racing. First Ezra with news of the railroad, and now this banker hinting at irregularities in land documents. What had Thomas gotten himself involved in? The rest of the day passed in a blur of work and worry. As evening approached, Martha found herself drawn to the small chest where she kept Thomas's personal effects. It was painful to look through them, each item a reminder of what she'd lost, but she needed answers. Inside the chest were Thomas's clothes, his pocket watch, a Bible that had belonged to his father, and a bundle of letters they'd exchanged during their courtship. Beneath these was a leather portfolio Martha had never examined closely before. It contained property deeds, their marriage certificate, and other legal documents. She spread these out on the kitchen table, looking for anything unusual. At first, nothing stood out. Then she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked into the back of the portfolio. It was a hand-drawn map of the region, with property boundaries marked in Thomas's neat handwriting. Several areas were circled with notes she couldn't decipher. The sound of a soft knock at the door made Martha jump. She hastily gathered the papers, returning them to the portfolio. "Who's there?" she called, reaching for her Winchester. "Swift Shadow," came the reply, the voice unmistakable in its quiet strength. Martha approached the door cautiously, rifle in hand. "What do you want?" "To speak with you. It's important." She hesitated, then unbolted the door, keeping the rifle visible. Swift Shadow stood on her porch, silhouetted against the setting sun. In one hand, he held what appeared to be a rabbit already cleaned and dressed. "For your table," he said, offering it to her. "The child needs meat." Martha lowered the rifle, slightly surprised by the gesture. "Thank you." She accepted the rabbit, noticing that Swift Shadow made no move to enter her home. "Would you like to come in?" He shook his head. "I will speak here. The Reynolds men are watching your ranch from the North Ridge. They have been there since midday." Martha's grip tightened on the rabbit. "How do you know?" "I have been watching them watch you." There was no boast in his voice, just a simple statements of fact. "They will not move tonight, but they are planning something." "How can you be sure?" Swift Shadow's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of old pain. "I know men like Clayton Reynolds. They believe the land and everything on it belongs to them by right." Martha thought of the banker's visit and Ezra's warnings. "Why are you telling me this? Why are you helping me?" For a long moment, Swift Shadow was silent, his gaze drifting past her to the interior of the house. Then he reached into his shirt and withdrew something that caught the last light of day, a pocket watch, its silver case dented and tarnished. "Because of this," he said, holding it out to her. "Because of him." Martha took the watch with trembling hands, recognizing it instantly as Thomas's. She'd thought it lost. It hadn't been among his possessions when his body was brought back to the ranch. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "From your husband," Swift Shadow said, as he lay dying. Martha's heart seemed to stop. "You were there when Thomas was shot." Swift Shadow nodded, his face solemn. "I was tracking a mountain lion that had been taking calves from my people's herd. I saw everything from the ridgeline. Reynolds and his son confronted your husband. There were words exchanged, then the younger one drew his weapon." Martha's legs felt weak. She leaned against the door frame, one hand going to her belly, as if to protect the child from the story. "I reached them too late." Swift Shadow continued, his voice soft but clear. "The shot was already fired. Reynolds and his son fled. I went to your husband. He was still alive, but only just." Tears welled in Martha's eyes. "What did he say?" "He asked me to look after you, said you would need protection." Swift Shadow's gaze was steady. "I promised him I would." With his last breath, he gave me the watch and said, "Tell her to keep fighting for the land. It's more important than she knows." Martha opened the watch with shaking fingers. Inside the case was a small photograph of her on their reciting day, smiling into the camera with all the hope of youth. On the opposite side, something had been added, a tiny piece of paper with numbers written in Thomas's hand. "I don't understand," she said. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "I have been watching over you since that day," Swift Shadow replied, "but I am Apache. In town, they would not have believed me if I had said I witnessed a murder. They would have accused me of the crime." Martha knew he was right. The prejudice against natives was strong in the territory. "And I was not sure if you would welcome help from someone like me," he added. Martha looked up from the watch, studying the man before her. In the fading light, she could see the weight he carried, not just the responsibility of his promise to Thomas, but something deeper, older. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. "Ezra Sullivan said you used to scout for the army." A shadow crossed Swift Shadow's face. "That was another life, for I understood what the army truly wanted from my people." Martha wanted to ask more, but she sensed he wouldn't answer. Instead, she said, "Why come forward now?" "Because the danger is growing. Reynolds will not stop until he has what he wants." Swift Shadow glanced toward the north ridge, though it was too dark now to see if anyone was there. "You need to be prepared." Martha straightened, drawing strength from some deep reserve. "I am as prepared. I've been fighting Clayton Reynolds since the day he killed my husband." Swift Shadow shook his head. "Not like this. Not alone." He reached into the pouch at his belt and withdrew something else, a small object wrapped in buckskin. "If you need me, use this." Martha unwrapped it to find a small, carved wooden whistle. "What is it?" "A signal. Blow once for warning, twice for danger, 3 times if your life is at immediate risk." Swift Shadow stepped back from the door. "I will hear it." "Where will you be?" Martha asked. He gestured to the hills beyond her property, watching, listening. His eyes met hers, and for a moment Martha glimpsed something behind his stoic exterior, a deep well of emotion carefully controlled. "I made a promise to your husband, Martha Coleman. I intend to keep it." Before she could respond, Swift Shadow had melted into the gathering darkness, leaving Martha alone with Thomas's watch, a wooden whistle, and the weight of everything she just learned. She closed the door and leaned against it, her mind reeling. Thomas's last words, the mysterious numbers in the watch, Swift Shadow's promise, it was too much to take in all at once. The baby kicked a strong, insistent movement that brought Martha back to the present. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the life growing within her. "It's all right," she whispered. "I won't let them take our home, I promise." She moved to the kitchen, placing the rabbit Swift Shadow had brought on the table. As she prepared to cook, Martha's gaze fell on the leather portfolio with Thomas's papers. She would need to examine them more carefully, especially in light of what the banker had said about questionable land documents. But that would have to wait until morning. For now, she had a meal to prepare, a ranch to secure, and a promise of her own to keep to her husband, to her unborn child, and to herself. Outside, the New Mexico night deepened, stars appearing one by one in the vast sky. Somewhere in the darkness, an Apache warrior kept watch honoring a deathbed promise. And on the north ridge, hidden by shadow, men from the Double R Ranch observed the small adobe house waiting for orders from Clayton Reynolds. The stage was set. The players were in motion, and Martha Coleman stood at the center of it all, unaware that the land she fought so hard to keep held secrets that would change everything. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the sun climbing rapidly into a cloudless sky. Martha woke with Thomas's watch clutched in her hand, the impression of its case pressed into her palm. She'd fallen asleep studying the numbers he'd written inside, trying to decipher their meaning. So far, they remained a mystery. Her back ached as she rose from bed, the weight of her pregnancy making every movement more deliberate. The baby had been active during the night, as if sensing her restlessness. Now it seemed content to sleep, giving Martha a brief respite from the persistent kicking. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she brewed coffee and contemplated the day ahead. There were chores to be done and animals to feed, repairs to make, water to haul from the river. But her mind kept returning to Swift Shadow's warning about Reynolds' men watching her ranch. Martha was just finishing her coffee when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. She moved to the window, Winchester at the ready, but relaxed when she recognized the visitor. Abigail Hayes, one of the oldest residents of Rio Blanco. At 80, Abigail was a living link to the territory's past. Born to a Pueblo mother and a Spanish father, she had witnessed the transition from Mexican to American rule, survived Apache raids and cavalry campaigns, and outlived 3 husbands. Her weathered face and silver hair spoke of a lifetime under the southwestern sun, but her dark eyes remained sharp and clear. Martha stepped onto the porch as Abigail's wagon pulled up to the hitching post. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes." "No Mrs. Hayes from you, child," the old woman chided, her voice carrying the musical lilt of her mixed heritage. "I've known you since you first came to this territory, all wide-eyed and city-soft. It's Abigail or nothing." Despite her worries, Martha smiled. "Abigail, then. What brings you out this way?" The older woman climbed down from her wagon with surprising agility, waving off Martha's offer of help. "Heard you might need some supplies and some company." She reached into the wagon bed and withdrew a basket covered with a cloth. "Brought you some of my cornbread and dried apple preserves. Baby needs sweetness." Martha accepted the basket gratefully. "You didn't have to do that." "Course I did." Abigail's eyes narrowed as she took in Martha's appearance. "You look tired, child. Not sleeping." Martha hesitated, unsure how much to share. But if anyone knew the history of this land and its people, it was Abigail Hayes. "Come inside," Martha said. "There's something I need to ask you about." Once they were settled at the kitchen table, Martha showed Abigail the watch and the numbers Thomas had written inside. "Do these mean anything to you?" she asked. Abigail examined them carefully, her brow furrowing. "Could be coordinates, or a deed reference." She looked up at Martha. "Where did you get this?" Martha took a deep breath and told Abigail everything: Thomas's death, Swift Shadow's appearance, the banker's hints about questionable land documents, and Reynolds' increasing pressure to take her ranch. Abigail listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. When Martha finished, the older woman was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the numbers in the watch. "There's something you should know about this land," she said finally, "something that goes back to before any of us were born." Martha leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. "What is it?" "This valley has always been special," Abigail began, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a practiced storyteller. "My mother's people knew it. The Apache knew it. Even the first Spanish settlers sensed it. There's water here, not just the Rio Grande, but older water, deeper." "An aquifer?" Martha asked, remembering what Ezra had said. Abigail nodded. "The ancient ones called it the veins of the Earth Mother, a network of underground rivers, pure and sweet, that never runs dry, even in the worst droughts." She gestured toward the window, toward the dry creek bed visible in the distance. "That little creek of yours, it's fed by one of those veins. Most years it flows because it taps into the deep water. This drought's been bad enough to affect even that, but the water is still there beneath your feet." Martha thought of the way Clayton Reynolds had increased his offers for the ranch as the drought worsened. "And Clayton knows about this." "He suspects," Abigail corrected. "His father might have known more. Old Man Reynolds came to this territory around the same time as your husband's father. They were friends once, if you can believe it." This was news to Martha. Thomas had never mentioned any connection between his family and the Reynolds. What happened between them? She asked. Abigail shrugged. The usual. Greed, ambition. When water's scarce and land's plentiful, the man who controls the water controls everything. She tapped the watch. These numbers, I think they might be a location. Somewhere your Thomas thought was important. Martha remembered the map she'd found in Thomas's portfolio. Wait here. She retrieved the leather folder and spread the map on the table. Together they examined it, looking for any correlation with the numbers in the watch. Here, Abigail said, suddenly pointing to one of the circled areas on the map. These markings match the first set of numbers. I'd bet my last dollar this is where your creek connects to the main aquifer. Martha stared at the map, trying to visualize the location in relation to her property. It's near the old Spanish mission ruins in that rocky section where the creek begins. Makes sense, Abigail nodded. The Spanish often built near water sources. She studied the other circled areas. And these might be other access points to the aquifer. Martha's mind was racing. So Thomas was mapping the underground water system. Looks that way. Abigail's expression grew serious. Martha, if Clayton Reynolds gets hold of this map, he could control all the water in the valley. In a drought like this, that would give him power over every ranch and farm for miles. The implications were staggering. It wasn't just about the railroad or even Martha's small ranch anymore. It was about the future of the entire region. But why would Thomas keep this secret? Martha wondered aloud. Why not share the information? Abigail's eyes were knowing. Because your husband understood what would happen if someone like Clayton Reynolds got control of the water. He'd bleed the small ranchers dry, literally and figuratively. Martha thought of the banker's hint about questionable land documents. Samuel Holloway, the banker who came yesterday, he mentioned something about land ownership records not being legitimate. A shadow crossed Abigail's face. That doesn't surprise me. When the territory changed hands from Mexico to the United States, there was a lot of confusion about who owned what. Many old Spanish and Mexican land grants were ignored or reinterpreted by the new authorities. You think Clayton has been falsifying documents? I think he wouldn't be the first to do so, Abigail said carefully. And if your Thomas was investigating water rights, he might have uncovered evidence of such fraud. Martha sat back, one hand going to her belly as the baby stirred again. That would explain why they killed him, not just for refusing to sell, but because he knew too much. And it explains why they're so determined to get your land now, Abigail added. With the railroad coming and the drought worsening, controlling that water becomes even more valuable. They were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch, multiple riders moving fast. Martha grabbed her Winchester and moved to the window. It's Reynolds' men, she said, recognizing Carter at the head of the group. 5 of them. Abigail joined her at the window, her expression hardening. They won't try anything with me here. Clayton may be ruthless, but he's not stupid enough to harm an old woman everyone in the territory knows. Martha wasn't so sure, but she nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Stay inside, I'll talk to them. She stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but visibly at her side. Carter Reynolds reined in his horse at the edge of her yard, his companions spreading out in a loose semicircle behind him. Morning, Martha, Carter called, his tone falsely pleasant. Saw you had company and thought I'd check in. Everything all right out here? Everything's fine, Carter, Martha replied coolly. What do you want? His smile didn't reach his eyes. Just being neighborly. Pa sent me to remind you about that mortgage payment. Bank's getting anxious. I've got 3 months before any action can be taken, Martha said, as I told Mr. Holloway yesterday. Carter's smile slipped. Holloway came out here interesting. Man ought to remember who pays his salary. He adjusted his hat, studying Martha with a calculating gaze. You know, Martha, life would be a lot easier if you'd just accept my proposal. A woman in your condition shouldn't be out here alone. I'm not alone, Martha said, her voice steady. Carter laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. All right, your Indian friend. His hand moved to rest on his revolver. So I'm skulking around your property last night. You should know there's a bounty on renegade Apaches in this territory. Man could make good money turning one in. Martha felt a chill run down her spine, but kept her expression neutral. Swift Shadow isn't a renegade, and he's under my protection as long as he's on my land. Your land, Carter repeated the words with contempt. For now. He turned his horse, preparing to leave. Think about my offer, Martha. It's the best you're going to get. As they rode away, Abigail came to stand beside Martha on the porch. That boy's trouble, she said quietly. Always has been. Even as a child, he had meanness in him. Martha watched until the riders disappeared over the ridge. He threatened swift shadow. Not surprising. The Reynolds have always hated the Apache. Abigail's voice was bitter. Clayton's father made his first fortune selling guns to both sides during the wars. Profit from blood. They went back inside and Martha put on water for tea, her mind turning over everything she'd learned. The underground water, the questionable land documents, Thomas's map. It was all connected and all dangerous. What should I do? She asked finally as they sat with their tea. Abigail considered the question. First, you need to secure that map and those numbers. Keep them hidden but accessible. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. Second, you need allies. Not just the Apache, though he'll be valuable. You need people in town who can stand with you against Clayton. Ezra Sullivan has been supportive, Martha said, and maybe Samuel Holloway if he's truly concerned about the land documents. Good, that's a start. Abigail set down her cup. But most important, you need to be prepared for when they come in force. Because they will, Martha. Once Clayton realizes you know about the water and possibly about the fraudulent documents, he'll have to move quickly. Martha's hand went to her belly where the baby had begun kicking again. I won't leave. This land is all I have left of Thomas. It's my child's birthright. Abigail reached across the table and took Martha's hand in her weathered one. Then we'll fight together. For the land, for the water, and for your child's future. After Abigail left, promising to send word if she heard anything in town, Martha returned to the map and the watch. There was a second set of numbers she hadn't yet matched to any location. She studied the map again, looking for any pattern or correlation. Then it hit her these weren't coordinates or deed references. They were dates. And the second set corresponded to approximately a month before Thomas was killed. Martha's heart raced. Had Thomas discovered something specific on that date, something that had led directly to his murder? She was still pondering this when she heard a soft sound at the back door. Martha grabbed her rifle and moved cautiously toward the noise. Who's there? She called. Friend, came the reply, the voice unfamiliar and hushed. Martha kept the rifle raised. Show yourself. A man stepped into view, young, maybe mid-20s, with the worn clothes and calloused hands of a ranch hand. He kept his hands visible, clearly aware of the rifle pointed at him. Name's James Butler, he said. I work for the Double R. Don't mean you any harm, Mrs. Coleman. Martha didn't lower the weapon. What do you want? To talk. His eyes darted nervously toward the surrounding landscape. About your husband, about what happened to him. Martha's grip on the rifle tightened. What about my husband? James Butler took a deep breath as if steeling himself. I was there the day he was shot. I saw everything. The world seemed to narrow to this moment, this man, these words. Martha's voice, when she found it, was barely more than a whisper. Tell me. Butler glanced over his shoulder again. Not here. Too open. Can we go inside? Against her better judgment, Martha nodded, gesturing for him to enter through the back door. Once in the kitchen, she kept the rifle at the ready, unwilling to fully trust this stranger who claimed to have witnessed her husband's murder. Talk, she said. Butler removed his hat, twisting it nervously in his hands. I was riding fence that day. Saw Mr. Reynolds and Carter meet your husband near the property line. There was arguing, couldn't hear what about. Then Carter pulled his gun. And shot Thomas, Martha finished, her voice flat. Butler nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. Yes, ma'am, point blank. No warning, no fair chance to draw, just shot him down. And then they left him to die. It wasn't a question. Not right away. Butler's voice was low. Mr. Reynolds, he searched your husband first. Took something from his pocket. Papers looked like. Then they rode off. Martha thought of the watch Swift Shadow had returned to her. Thomas must have had it in a different pocket one Reynolds had missed. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. It's been a year. Butler looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. There was shame there and fear. Because they're planning to kill you too, tonight. Make it look like an accident. He swallowed hard. I can't have that on my conscience. Not a woman with child. Martha felt the blood drain from her face. How do you know this? Overheard Carter talking to some hired guns, not regular ranch hands. They're planning to fire the barn while you sleep, then shoot anyone who comes out. Butler put his hat back on, backing toward the door. I've said too much already. If they find out I was here... Wait, Martha said. Why should I believe you? Butler paused his hand on the door. Because I've got a sister about your age. Lost her husband in the war. I'd want someone to warn her. His eyes flicked to her belly. That baby deserves a chance. Before Martha could respond, he slipped out the door and was gone, leaving her alone with the terrible warning. Martha moved to the window, scanning the surrounding landscape. Nothing seemed amiss, but Butler's words had filled her with a new urgency. If what he said was true, she had only hours to prepare. She thought of Swift Shadow and the wooden whistle he'd given her. 2 blows for danger, he'd said. Martha reached for it, hanging on a cord around her neck, but hesitated. What if Butler was lying? What if this was some trick to lure Swift Shadow into the open? Oh, she decided. The fear in Butler's eyes had been genuine. And even if there was some doubt, she couldn't risk ignoring the warning. Martha stepped onto the back porch and raised the whistle to her lips. 2 sharp blasts pierced the afternoon quiet, the sound carrying across the valley. Then she returned inside to prepare. Whether help came or not, Martha Coleman would not go down without a fight. In the hills above the ranch, Swift Shadow heard the signal and began his descent, moving with the silent speed that had earned him his name. And in town, Clayton Reynolds sat in his study finalizing plans that would either secure his control over the valley's water or expose decades of fraud and murder. The pieces were moving, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, and at the center of it all, a widow and her unborn child prepared to make their stand. As dusk approached, Martha worked methodically to prepare the ranch for the attack Butler had warned her about. She moved her most valuable possessions, Thomas's papers, family keepsakes, and a small amount of emergency money to a hiding place beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom. She filled every available container with water, placing them strategically around the house in case of fire. And she positioned her weapons, the Winchester Thomas's old revolver and a shotgun that had belonged to his father, where she could reach them quickly from different parts of the house. The baby was restless, responding to her attention with increased movement. Martha paused in her preparations, placing a hand on her belly and taking a deep breath. "It's all right," she murmured. "We're going to be fine." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Martha wondered if she was fooling herself. One woman pregnant and alone against Clayton Reynolds and his men, the odds weren't good. The sound of footsteps on the porch startled her. Martha grabbed the Winchester and moved to the window, peering cautiously through the gathering darkness. Swift Shadow stood at her door, bow in hand, his expression as calm as if he were paying a social call. Relief washed over Martha as she unbolted the door to let him in. "You heard the signal?" she said. He nodded once. "I was already on my way. Saw Reynolds' men gathering at the north camp." Martha quickly told him about James Butler's warning and the attack plan for that night. Swift Shadow listened without interruption, his dark eyes giving away nothing of his thoughts. "We should leave," he said when she had finished. "Now while there is still light." Martha shook her head. "I'm not abandoning my home. It is not abandonment to live and fight another day." Swift Shadow argued, his voice remaining calm despite the urgency of his words. "The child must be your first concern." Martha's hand went to her belly. "This child is exactly why I can't leave. This land is all I have to give him or her. It's all that's left of Thomas." Swift Shadow studied her, and Martha had the sense he was seeing beyond her words to the deeper fear beneath, that if she left now, she might never return. That everything she and Thomas had built would be lost forever. "Then we prepare," he said finally, "but not alone." Before Martha could ask what he meant, Swift Shadow moved to the door. "Come with me." Curious, Martha followed him onto the porch. The sun had set, but the afterglow still painted the western sky in shades of orange and purple. Swift Shadow raised 2 fingers to his lips and produced a whistle that sounded uncannily like a desert nighthawk. In response, shadows detached themselves from the darkening landscape, 5 figures moving silently toward the house. As they drew closer, Martha could make out details: 3 men and 2 women, all Apache, all armed with bows or rifles. Swift Shadow spoke to them in their own language, his voice low and musical. One of the men, older than the others, was silver, streaking his black hair, and lines of wisdom etched into his face, replied at length, occasionally gesturing toward Martha in the house. Finally, Swift Shadow turned to her. "This is Running Fox, elder of my band. He has agreed to help defend your home. Martha stepped forward, uncertain of the proper greeting, but determined to show respect. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your help is unexpected, but welcome." Running Fox regarded her with eyes that seemed to contain the wisdom of centuries. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "Swift Shadow says you carry a child, that you fight for your land against those who would take it by force." "Yes," Martha confirmed. The old man nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected. "Then we fight with you. The land remembers those who defend it." Martha felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, relief, and something deeper she couldn't name. "I don't know how to repay you." Running Fox's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Water," he said. "When the rains return to your creek, remember that water belongs to no one and everyone." Martha thought of the underground aquifer Abigail had told her about, the veins of the Earth Mother that ran beneath her property. "I understand," she said, "and I promise." With that settled, they moved quickly to prepare defenses. The Apache warriors were efficient and purposeful, using the ranch's natural features to create vantage points in kill zones. One of the women, Silent Arrow Swift Shadow called her, helped Martha fortify the house itself, showing her how to create defensive positions at the windows. As they worked, Martha's curiosity got the better of her. "How do you know Swift Shadow?" she asked. Silent Arrow's hands didn't pause in their task of arranging furniture to provide cover. "He saved my son 2 winters ago when the sickness came. Many children died. Mine lived because of his knowledge of medicine." Martha glanced through the window to where Swift Shadow was directing the placement of traps along the most likely approach routes. "He seems to have many skills." "He was trained by both worlds," Silent Arrow said. "His father was Apache, his mother Mexican. The army taught him their ways of war. Our people taught him our ways of healing. He walks between worlds, belonging fully to none." Martha thought of her own unborn child, who would also carry a complex heritage, Eastern roots through her Western frontier through Thomas. That must be difficult. Silent Arrow's dark eyes met Martha's. "It gives him sight others lack. He sees what most miss." She returned to her work, adding, "It is why he saw the worth in you when others might not." Before Martha could ask what she meant, Swift Shadow himself entered the house. "They're coming," he said without preamble. 8 riders approaching from the north. Carter Reynolds leads them. Martha felt a cold determination settle over her. "Then let's welcome them properly." The night had fully fallen, now the landscape illuminated only by starlight and a quarter moon. Martha took up position at the front window of the house, Winchester ready. Swift Shadow had disappeared into the darkness, with Running Fox and the others each taking a predetermined position around the property. The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched like hours as Martha strained to hear any sound of approach. The baby seemed to sense her tension, moving restlessly within her. Then she heard it, the soft thud of hooves on earth, deliberately slow and cautious. They were trying to approach quietly, using the darkness as cover. Martha steadied her breathing, remembering Thomas's lessons on marksmanship. "Wait until you have a clear shot. Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger. Don't rush." The first rider appeared at the edge of the yard, a dark silhouette against the night sky, then another and another. Martha counted 8 in total, just as Swift Shadow had said. They spread out, encircling the house. Carter Reynolds' voice cut through the darkness. "Martha, we know you're in there. Come out and talk." Martha remained silent, watching as the riders drew closer to the house. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Carter called. "My father's willing to be generous, full market value for the ranch, enough for you to start fresh somewhere else." One of the riders dismounted, moving toward the barn with what looked like a torch in hand. Martha adjusted her aim, focusing on this immediate threat. The whisper of an arrow cutting through air was the only warning before chaos erupted. The dismounted man cried out, dropping to one knee as an arrow found its mark in his thigh. Simultaneously, another arrow struck the ground at Carter's horse's feet, causing the animal to rear in panic. "Apache!" someone shouted, and the night exploded with gunfire. Martha held her position, waiting for a clear shot. The riders were firing blindly into the darkness, unsure where the attack was coming from. Swift Shadow and his people had positioned themselves perfectly, using the confusion to their advantage. A rider broke from the group, making a dash for the barn, torch held high. Martha took aim and fired. The Winchester's report was deafening in the confined space of the house. The rider tumbled from his horse, the torch extinguishing as it hit the ground. Another arrow found its mark, and another rider fell. The remaining men began to retreat, firing as they withdrew. Martha ducked as bullets splintered the window frame above her head. Then as suddenly as it had begun, the attack was over. The sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Martha waited, gun still ready, until Swift Shadow appeared at the door. "They're gone," he confirmed. "For now." Martha lowered the rifle, her hands shaking slightly from the release of tension. "Anyone hurt on our side?" "No, they fired wildly with no aim." There was a hint of disdain in Swift Shadow's voice. "Two of theirs are wounded. They took them when they fled." Martha moved to the porch, needing to see the damage for herself. In the pale moonlight, she could make out the evidence of the brief violent encounter: a few arrows embedded in the earth, a dark stain that might be blood, the extinguished torch lying where it had fallen. "They'll be back," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "With more men next time." Swift Shadow nodded. "Yes, and they will be more careful." He turned to face her, his expression grave in the dim light. "Martha Coleman, you fought well tonight, but the next fight will be harder." Running Fox approached, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "We have a saying: the coyote may retreat, but he does not forget where the rabbits live." The old man's eyes were knowing. These men will return with more guns, more anger. Martha knew they were right. Carter had been testing her defenses tonight, probing for weaknesses. The real attack was yet to come. "What should we do?" she asked. Swift Shadow and Running Fox exchanged a look. Then Swift Shadow said, "We go to their camp. Now, while they lick their wounds, we learn their plans." "I'll come with you," Martha began, but Swift Shadow shook his head. "You stay. Protect the house. Silent Arrow will remain with you." His voice softened slightly. "Rest if you can. The child needs your strength." Yeah. Martha wanted to argue, but exhaustion was already settling over her like a heavy blanket. The excitement and fear of the attack, combined with her pregnancy, had drained her more than she'd realized. "Be careful," she said instead. Swift Shadow's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "Always." As he and Running Fox melted into the darkness, Martha returned to the house. Silent Arrow was already there, calmly repairing the damaged window frame. "You should sleep," the Apache woman said, without looking up from her work. "I will watch." Martha wanted to protest that she couldn't possibly sleep after what had happened, but her body disagreed. The moment she sat down on her bed, weariness overwhelmed her. She lay back, intending only to rest for a moment, and was asleep almost instantly. She dreamed of Thomas standing by the creek when it still flowed strong and clear. The water remembers, he told her in the dream, and so does the land. Martha woke with a start, disoriented by the gray light of pre-dawn filtering through the curtains. She'd slept through the night, something she hadn't done since Thomas died. Silent Arrow was still at her post by the window, as vigilant as when Martha had left her. "They are returning," she said simply. Martha moved quickly to join her, ignoring the protestations of her stiff back. In the distance, she could make out two figures approaching on foot: Swift Shadow and Running Fox, moving with the ground-eating lope of men accustomed to covering long distances. By the time Martha reached the porch, they were climbing the steps. Swift Shadow's expression was grim. "Clayton Reynolds arrived at the camp just before dawn," he reported. "He brought more men, professionals, not ranch hands. They plan to attack in force tomorrow at first light." Martha's mouth went dry. "How many?" "20, maybe more." Running Fox's voice was matter of fact. "With rifles and dynamite." "Dynamite," Martha echoed, alarmed. Swift Shadow nodded. "They mean to destroy what they cannot take." Martha's hand went to her belly, where the baby had begun its morning movements. The thought of dynamite, of fire and destruction and death, made her feel physically ill. "We need more help," she said. "We can't face that many, not with just the 6 of us." Swift Shadow and Running Fox exchanged another of their inscrutable looks. Then Running Fox said, "There are others who might stand with us. Not Apache, but people from the town who remember what it means to fight for what is theirs." "Ezra Sullivan," Martha suggested, "and maybe Samuel Holloway, the banker." "And the old woman who visited yesterday," Silent Arrow added. "She has respect among the town people." Martha thought of Abigail Hayes, with her knowledge of the land and its history. Yes, Abigail would help if she could. Swift Shadow seemed to come to a decision. "I will go to the town, speak to these allies." Martha shook her head. "It's too dangerous. If Clayton's men see you in town, they might shoot first and ask questions later." "I will not be seen," Swift Shadow said with quiet confidence. and we need their help." Martha knew he was right. Even with the skill of the Apache warriors, they couldn't hope to repel 20 armed men with dynamite. "Be careful," she said again, feeling like a child repeating the only comfort she knew. Swift Shadow's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that needed no words. "I will return before nightfall," he promised, "with help or with news that we must find another way." As he left, Martha turned to Running Fox and Silent Arrow. "We should prepare as best we can in case the attack comes sooner than expected." They spent the morning reinforcing defenses, setting more traps, and creating fallback positions in case the house was breached. The work was hard, especially for Martha in her condition, but she refused to rest. This was her home, her land, her fight. Around midday, as they were taking a brief break for water and food, Fuist approached Martha with something in his hand, a small leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. "For the child," he said, offering it to her, "a medicine bundle, to give strength and protection." Martha accepted it with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, it's beautiful." The old man's weathered face softened. "When my grandson was born during the time of great fear, when the army was hunting our people, such a bundle kept him safe. May it do the same for your child." Martha was touched by the gift and the story behind it. "Your grandson is he with your band now." A shadow passed over Running Fox's face. "He walks with the ancestors, taken by the fever 2 winters ago." He paused, then added, "Swift Shadow tried to save him, did everything a healer could do. But some spirits are called home early." Martha's heart ached for the old man's loss. "I'm sorry." Running Fox nodded acceptance of her sympathy. He lived 8 summers, knew joy and love. Some never know even that much. His gaze moved to the distant mountains. "Swift Shadow carries the weight of those he could not save. It is why he fights so hard for those he can." Martha thought of the way Swift Shadow had come to her aid, of his promise to Thomas, of his determination to help her keep her land. "He's a good man." "Yes," Running Fox agreed, "though he does not always believe it himself." Before Martha could ask what he meant, one of the other Apache warriors, Windrunner, she thought his name, was approached with urgent news. A rider was approaching from the direction of town. Martha grabbed her Winchester and moved to the porch, the others following. The rider was still some distance away, but closing fast. As he drew nearer, Martha recognized him, James Butler, the ranch hand who had warned her about the attack. He reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, hands held high to show he meant no harm. His face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut. "Mrs. Coleman," he called, "I've come to warn you again. They know I talked to you. Reynolds is moving up the attack. They're coming tonight, not tomorrow." Martha's blood ran cold. "When tonight?" "Sundown. They don't want to give you time to get more help." Butler's eyes darted to the Apache warriors standing beside her, clearly surprised to see them there. "I can't stay. If they find out I've been here again." "Why are you doing this?" Martha asked. "Why risk yourself for me?" Butler's battered face twisted in what might have been a smile. "Maybe I'm tired of working for men who think they own the world and everyone in it." He tipped his hat. "Good luck, Mrs. Coleman. You're going to need it." As he rode away, Martha turned to Running Fox, her mind racing. "Sundown, that's only a few hours from now. Swift Shadow won't be back in time with help from town." The old warrior's expression remained calm. "Then we fight with what we have." He gestured to his people, issuing orders in their language. They moved immediately to adjust their preparations for the earlier timeline. Martha felt the baby kick a strong, insistent movement that seemed to echo her own determination. She placed a hand on her belly, drawing strength from the life within her. "We'll be ready," she said, as much to herself as to the child. "This is our land, our home, and no one is going to take it from us." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Martha Coleman and her unlikely allies prepared to make their stand. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would emerge victorious in the battle for its future. And somewhere between the ranch and town, Swift Shadow was riding hard, unaware that the timeline had changed, that the fight he had prepared for was about to begin without him. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Under different circumstances, Martha might have paused to appreciate the beauty of the New Mexico sunset. Instead, she checked her Winchester for the third time in as many minutes, ensuring it was loaded and ready. From her position at the upstairs window, she had a clear view of the approaches to the ranch. Running Fox had positioned his warriors strategically around the property's Silent Arrow, in the barn loft with her bow-wind runner, and the others concealed among the rocks and scrub brush that dotted the landscape. The plan was simple, out of necessity. They would let Reynolds' men approach, then catch them in a crossfire when they were committed to the attack. Martha would provide covering fire from the house while the Apache warriors would strike from the flanks and rear. It wasn't much of a plan against 20 armed men with dynamite, but it was all they had. Martha's back ached from standing so long at the window, and the baby seemed particularly active, as if sensing her tension. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the strong movements beneath her palm. "Not much longer now," she murmured, though whether she was referring to the wait for the attack or the weeks until the child's birth, she couldn't have said. The sound of approaching riders reached her ears before she saw them, the steady drumbeat of hooves on hard-packed earth, growing louder with each passing moment. Martha's mouth went dry, but her hands remained steady on the rifle. They appeared first as distant shapes silhouetted against the darkening eastern sky. As they drew closer, details emerged: 20 riders, maybe more, moving in a loose formation. At their head rode Clayton Reynolds himself, distinguishable, even at a distance, by his tall, straight-back posture and the distinctive black hat he always wore. Carter rode at his father's right hand, and Martha felt a surge of cold anger at the sight of him. The man who had murdered Thomas, who had threatened her, who had tried again and again to take what wasn't his to claim. The riders halted just beyond rifle range, gathering in a tight group as if for a final conference. Martha could see Clayton gesturing, presumably giving last-minute instructions. Then they spread out into a wider formation and began to advance again, more slowly now, more deliberately. Martha's finger tensed on the trigger, but she held her fire, remembering Running Fox's instructions. "Wait until they are fully committed. Let them think the approach is undefended." Clayton's voice carried across the open space between them. "Martha Coleman, this is your last chance. Come out now and we can end this peacefully." Martha remained silent, watching as the riders drew closer. Through the window, she could see the confidence in their posture, the casual way they held their weapons. They expected little resistance, a lone woman heavily pregnant without the means or will to defend herself. How wrong they were. The laid riders were almost to the first line of traps, shallow pits covered with brush, barbed wire strung low between fence posts, where it would catch the horse's legs. Martha held her breath, waiting for the moment when the attack would begin in earnest. It came sooner than she expected. One of Reynolds' men, riding slightly ahead of the main group, suddenly pitched forward as an arrow struck him in the shoulder. His shout of pain and surprise was the signal for chaos to erupt. Martha fired the Winchester's report, echoing across the yard. Another rider fell. Arrows seemed to come from everywhere at once as the Apache warriors launched their attack. Clayton Reynolds shouted orders, trying to rally his men, but they were caught in the open targets for Martha's rifle and the Apache bows. Horses reared and bucked, throwing riders as they encountered the hidden traps. For a brief, glorious moment, Martha thought they might actually repel the attack. Reynolds' men were in disarray, caught between advancing into the deadly fire or retreating across ground now proven dangerous. Then she saw Carter break from the group, spurring his horse directly toward the house. In his hand was something that made Martha's blood run cold, a bundle of dynamite fuse already lit. Martha swung the Winchester toward him, sighted and fired. The bullet went wide as Carter's horse leapt a hidden obstacle. She worked the lever, chambering another round, but Carter was already too close to the house, drawing back his arm to throw the explosive. An arrow whistled through the air, striking Carter's horse in the flank. The animal screamed and reared, throwing Carter from the saddle. The dynamite flew from his hand, landing in the dirt a few yards from the porch. The fuse continued to burn, sparking in the gathering darkness. Martha froze for a split second, then dropped the rifle and ran for the stairs. She had to reach the dynamite to throw it away from the house before it exploded. Her pregnancy made her awkward, slow, but fear and determination drove her forward. She burst through the front door and onto the porch just as a figure darted from the shadows. Silent Arrow moving with the speed and grace of a deer. The Apache woman scooped up the dynamite in one smooth motion and hurled it away from the house toward an empty stretch of yard. The explosion rocked the evening air, sending dirt and debris flying in all directions. Martha was thrown back against the door frame, more from shock than the force of the blast. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Clayton Reynolds' voice, tight with anger. "Fall back! Regroup at the ridge!" The sound of retreating hoofbeats followed, punctuated by a few final shots. Then silence broken only by the soft moans of a wounded man somewhere in the yard. Silent Arrow appeared at Martha's side, her dark eyes scanning for injuries. "You are hurt." Martha shook her head, one hand automatically going to her belly. The baby kicked as if to reassure her. "I'm all right." Running Fox emerged from his position among the rocks, rifle in hand. "They will return," he said simply. Martha nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. They had repelled the first attack, but at what cost? How many more would come? As if reading her thoughts, Running Fox added, "We fought well. 3 of theirs are down. The rest will be more cautious now." Martha looked toward the ridge where Reynolds and his men had retreated. In the fading light, she could just make out the distant figures regrouping, no doubt planning their next move. "We need Swift Shadow," she said, "and the help he's gone to find." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching riders came from the direction of town, not from the ridge where Reynolds' men had gathered. Martha raised her rifle again, uncertain if this was reinforcement or a new threat. Running Fox shaded his eyes against the setting sun. Many riders, and he observed, 10, maybe more. Martha's heart sank. If these were more of Reynolds' men, they might be overwhelmed. But as the riders drew closer, a familiar figure became visible at their head, Swift Shadow riding a paint horse she hadn't seen before. And beside him, to Martha's astonishment, was Ezra Sullivan, the former sheriff, looking every inch the lawman despite his years. Behind them rode an unlikely assortment of allies. Samuel Holloway, the young banker, looking uncomfortable but determined on a borrowed horse. Abigail Hayes sitting tall and proud in a small wagon, and at least 6 other men from town, each armed and ready. Martha felt a surge of hope as they approached the ranch. She hadn't expected so many to stand with her against the power of Clayton Reynolds. Swift Shadow dismounted first, his eyes quickly taking in the signs of battle, the disturbed earth from the explosion, the arrow shafts embedded in the ground, the horses without riders milling nervously at the edge of the property. "You were attacked," he said, his voice tight with what might have been concern. Martha nodded. "About 20 men led by Clayton and Carter. We drove them back, but they're regrouping on the ridge." Ezra Sullivan climbed down from his horse with the deliberate movements of age, his lined face grim. "Clayton's gone too far this time," he said. "Attacking a widow on her own property, there's no law that justifies that." Samuel Holloway dismounted more awkwardly, adjusting his spectacles. "Mrs. Coleman, I brought something you should see." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio. "Land records. The originals, not the copies Clayton altered." Martha's eyes widened. "Altered?" The banker nodded, his expression a mix of shame and determination. "Clayton Reynolds has been falsifying documents for years, changing boundary lines, forging signatures. Half the properties he claims to own legally were actually acquired through fraud." Abigail Hayes snorted from her wagon seat. "Tell her the rest, young man." Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "There's more. The railroad survey, it's official now. The new line will run less than a mile from your property. And with the water rights—" He trailed off, looking to Abigail. The old woman picked up where he left off. "With the water rights and the railroad, your land is worth 20 times what it was a year ago. Maybe more." Martha took a moment to absorb this information. It all made sense now: Clayton's increasing pressure to acquire her ranch, his willingness to resort to violence, the urgency of his actions. "Thomas knew," she said softly. "He discovered the altered documents, didn't he? That's why Clayton had him killed." Samuel nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I suspected as much, but I didn't have proof until recently. Your husband came to the bank several times in the weeks before his death, requesting to see the original deeds." Ezra laid a hand on Martha's shoulder. "Martha, with these documents and witnesses willing to testify, we can bring charges against Clayton. Real charges, fraud, attempted murder, maybe even Thomas's murder, if Butler's willing to testify to what he saw." Martha thought of James Butler with his bruised face and guilty conscience. Would he stand against his employer when it came to a formal accusation? "First, we have to survive the night," she said, looking toward the ridge. "Clayton won't give up just because we have reinforcements. If anything, he'll be more desperate now." Swift Shadow, who had been conferring quietly with Running Fox, rejoined the group. "She is right. Reynolds has sent for more men from his ranch. They will attack again before dawn, with greater numbers." Ezra's weathered face hardened. "Then we'll be ready for them." He turned to the men who had ridden with him. Set up defensive positions. Anyone who's not comfortable with a gun can help fortify the house and barn. As the group dispersed to their tasks, Swift Shadow drew Martha aside. His dark eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "You fought well," he said, "but you should not have been in danger at all. I should have been here." Martha shook her head. "You couldn't have known they would attack early. And without the help you brought—" She left the sentence unfinished, both of them knowing what the outcome might have been. Swift Shadow's gaze dropped to her belly. "The child?" "Active," Martha said with a small smile, kicking up a storm through the whole fight. Something that might have been a smile flickered across Swift Shadow's face. "Strong like the mother." The almost smile faded. "Martha Coleman tonight will be dangerous, more dangerous than before. You should consider—" "I'm not leaving," she interrupted, her voice firm. "This is my home, my land. I won't be driven from it by fear or threats." Swift Shadow studied her for a long moment, then nodded once as if he'd expected nothing less. "Then we will stand together." As twilight deepened into night, Martha returned to the house to rest while she could. Abigail Hayes joined her, bringing a pot of strong tea and a practical attitude that Martha found surprisingly comforting. "Drink this," the older woman said, pouring a steaming cup. "My mother's recipe. Good for strength and calm." Martha accepted the tea, gratefully sinking into a chair by the fire. Her back ached from the tension and exertion of the day, and the baby seemed to be practicing somersaults in her womb. "I never expected so many to come to my aid," she said, watching as Abigail bustled around the kitchen, making herself at home. "Why would they risk themselves for me?" Abigail paused in her work, fixing Martha with a knowing look. "It's not just for you, child. It's for themselves, too. Clayton Reynolds has been squeezing this valley dry for years, buying up land, controlling water, driving out small ranchers. People are tired of living under his thumb." Martha sipped her tea, considering this. "And the documents Samuel brought, they could really bring Clayton to justice. If we live to present them to a judge, yes." Abigail's tone was matter-of-fact. "Clayton forged signatures, altered boundary lines, backdated documents. It's enough to send him to prison for a good long while." Martha's hand went to her belly as the baby kicked particularly hard. "All this risk, all this death for land and water." Abigail shook her head. "Not just land and water, child. Power. Control. Clayton Reynolds believes he has the right to take what he wants to shape the world according to his vision. Men like that are more dangerous than any drought, Tom, or wildfire." They fell silent, each lost in her own thoughts. Outside, Martha could hear the sounds of preparation men's voices. The occasional hammer or saw as they strengthened defenses, horses being moved to safer locations. "You should try to sleep," Abigail said eventually. "The baby needs rest even if you think you don't." Martha nodded, suddenly aware of how bone-weary she truly was. "Wake me if anything changes." "Of course." Martha moved to her bedroom, leaving the door ajar so she could hear if she was needed. She lay down, fully dressed, the Winchester within easy reach, and closed her eyes. Sleep came more easily than she would have expected, deep and dreamless. When she woke, the quality of the darkness had changed. It was the deep, still hour just before dawn, when night begins to lose its grip on the world. She rose quickly, checking the Winchester, before moving to the main room. Abigail was still awake, sitting by the window with a cup of tea in her gnarled hands. "Any word?" Martha asked. Abigail shook her head. "Quiet all night. Too quiet if you ask me." Martha went to the door, opening it carefully. The pre-dawn air was crisp and cool against her face. The yard was filled with shadows, men at their posts waiting. She could make out Ezra's distinctive silhouette near the barn, Swift Shadow's tall form by the corral. She stepped onto the porch, scanning the ridge where Reynolds' men had regrouped. It was too dark to see clearly, but she had the sense of movement there, of preparation. Swift Shadow materialized beside her, his approach as silent as always. "They are coming," he said simply. "Many more than before." Martha nodded, unsurprised. "How many?" 30, perhaps more. They have brought wagons for cover, I think." The implications were clear. This would not be a quick raid, but a sustained assault with men firing from behind the protection of the wagons, gradually advancing on the ranch. "We're outnumbered," Martha said, voicing what they both knew. Swift Shadow didn't contradict her. "Numbers are not everything. We have position knowledge of the land." He paused, then added, "And we fight for what is right. That gives strength beyond counting. Martha wished she could share his confidence. When will they attack and soon? Oi. With the first light. Swift Shadow's eyes searched the eastern horizon where the faintest lightening of the sky hinted at the coming dawn. You should be inside where it is safer. Martha shook her head. This is my fight as much as anyone's, more even. Before Swift Shadow could argue, Ezra joined them on the porch, his old army revolver holstered at his hip. Martha Swift Shadow, he greeted them. Everyone's in position. Samuel and Abigail have agreed to stay in the house with you, Martha. The rest of us will form a perimeter defense. Martha opened her mouth to protest that she didn't need protection, but Swift Shadow spoke first. A wise plan. The house is the most defensible position. She shot him a look, suspecting he was simply trying to keep her out of the direct line of fire. But there was logic in the arrangement, and Martha had to admit that her pregnancy made her less mobile than she would have liked. Fine, she conceded, but I'll be at the window with my rifle. I'm not hiding while others fight for me. Ezra nodded, a hint of approval in his tired eyes. Wouldn't expect anything less, Martha. You're your husband's wife, through and through. The mention of Thomas brought a familiar ache to Martha's heart, but also a renewed determination. She would not lose her home, her land, the last connection she had to the man she had loved. As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern sky, Martha took up her position at the upstairs window. Winchester loaded and ready. Samuel Holloway, looking nervous but resolute with a shotgun in his hand, stationed himself at another window. Abigail moved between them, ready to reload weapons or tend to injuries as needed. From her vantage point, Martha could see the ridge clearly now. What Swift Shadow had reported was accurate, at least 30 men with several wagons positioned as mobile barricades. At their head, unmistakable even at this distance, rode Clayton Reynolds, his black hat and commanding posture identifying him as surely as a flag. Carter was there too, his arm in a makeshift sling from his fall during the previous attack. The sight of him, of the man who had murdered Thomas, sent a cold anger through Martha's veins. The defenders of the ranch were spread out in a loose semicircle, using whatever cover the landscape provided. Ezra had positioned himself behind a low stone wall. The Apache warriors were hidden among rocks and brush, and the men from town had taken up positions near the barn and corral. Swift Shadow was nowhere to be seen, but Martha didn't doubt he was out there waiting for the moment to strike. Clayton's voice carried across the open space between them. This is your last chance, Martha. Send out the Apache and surrender the ranch, and no one else needs to get hurt. Martha's grip tightened on the Winchester. This is my land, Clayton, she shouted back. Legally mine, as the documents your son altered will prove. Leave now or face the consequences. A murmur ran through Reynolds' men. Clearly not all of them had been aware of their employer's fraudulent activities. Clayton silenced them with a sharp gesture. So be it, he called. The consequences are on your head. He raised his arm and his men began to advance, pushing the wagons before them as shields. The attack on Martha Coleman's ranch had begun in earnest, and the future of the valley hung in the balance. The first shot came from Clayton's line, a rifle crack that sent splinters flying from the window frame near Martha's head. She ducked instinctively, then steadied herself and returned fire, aiming for the men pushing the wagons forward. Her shot found its mark. One of Reynolds' men stumbled and fell, clutching his leg. The others hesitated, momentarily disorganized. It was all the opening Ezra and the defenders needed. A volley of gunfire erupted from the ranch's perimeter, focused and disciplined. Two more of Clayton's men went down. An arrow from Running Fox's bow struck another in the shoulder, spinning him around with the force of the impact. Martha worked the Winchester's lever, chambering another round. The familiar motion grounded her, pushing back the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Thomas had taught her to shoot patiently, correcting her stance and grip until she could hit a can at 50 paces. Now those lessons might save her life and the lives of those who had chosen to stand with her. Clayton's men regrouped quickly, using the wagons for cover as they returned fire. The air filled with the sound of gunshots and the acrid smell of powder. Bullets thudded into the adobe walls of the house, puffs of dust marking their impact. They're trying to pin us down, Samuel observed from his position at the other window. Keep us from moving while they advance. Martha nodded, impressed by the young banker's tactical awareness. We need to slow their approach. As if in answer to her thought, a shout went up from one of the wagons. Fire had somehow erupted in the hay bales they were using for additional protection. The men scattered, momentarily exposed. Martha and the other defenders took advantage of their combined fire, dropping 3 more of Clayton's men. Through the smoke and confusion, Martha caught a glimpse of Swift Shadow darting from cover to cover, a burning arrow notched in his bow. So that was how the fire had started. The Apache warrior was already gone, moving to his next target before Clayton's men could track his position. For a brief, hopeful moment, Martha thought they might actually repel the attack. Reynolds' men were falling back, regrouping around their employer, who gesticulated angrily from his horse. Then Carter Reynolds broke from the group, spurring his horse directly toward the house. In his good hand, he held what looked like a bundle of dynamite, similar to the one from the previous attack. Martha took aim, but Carter was moving erratically, making himself a difficult target. She fired and missed. Samuel tried as well, the shotgun's report deafening in the confined space, but the distance was too great for the weapon to be effective. Carter was halfway to the house when Swift Shadow emerged from seemingly nowhere, tackling him from his horse. The 2 men went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling in the dust. The dynamite flew from Carter's hand, landing several yards away, its fuse thankfully unlit. Martha watched in horror as Carter and Swift Shadow fought hand to hand. Despite his injured arm, Carter was a large man with the strength and meanness of someone accustomed to getting his way through force. Swift Shadow was quicker, more skilled, but the fight was dangerously close to Clayton's advancing men. A shot rang out not from the house, but from the ridge. Swift Shadow staggered, clutching his side. He recovered quickly, landing a solid blow to Carter's jaw that sent the younger Reynolds sprawling. But the damage was done. Blood seeped between Swift Shadow's fingers where he pressed them to his wound. "Swift Shadow's hit," Martha cried, her heart pounding with fear. Before anyone could respond, Ezra Sullivan broke cover, running toward the wounded Apache with surprising speed for a man his age. He reached Swift Shadow just as Carter was struggling to his feet and laid the younger Reynolds out with a solid punch that spoke of years of lawman's experience. Together, Ezra and Swift Shadow retreated toward the house, the former sheriff supporting the wounded warrior. Clayton's men fired after them, but the shots went wide, their aim disrupted by covering fire from the ranch's defenders. Martha abandoned her post at the window, rushing downstairs to meet them at the door. Ezra half-carried Swift Shadow, inside his weathered face grim. "Bullet grazed his side," the former sheriff reported. "Looks worse than it is, but he's losing blood." Abigail was already there, directing them to lay Swift Shadow on the kitchen table. "I need clean cloths, hot water, and my medicine bag from the wagon," she ordered, rolling up her sleeves. Martha moved to help, but Swift Shadow caught her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong despite his injury. "No," he said, his voice strained but clear. "You must watch. They will not stop because one man is wounded." She knew he was right. Reluctantly, Martha returned to her post at the upstairs window, leaving Swift Shadow in Abigail's capable hands. The battle had intensified during those brief moments inside. Clayton's men had advanced behind the remaining wagons, pushing steadily toward the ranch house. The defenders were being forced back step by step despite their determined resistance. Martha took aim at a man who had broken from cover, dropping him with a clean shot. But for every one that fell, it seemed 2 more took his place. Clayton Reynolds had assembled a small army for this assault, and they were gradually overwhelming the ranch's defenses. A cry from outside drew Martha's attention. One of the men from town, she didn't know his name, had been hit. He lay in the open, exposed to further fire. Without hesitation, Running Fox darted from cover, dragging the wounded man to safety behind the corral. The selfless act seemed to galvanize the defenders. They renewed their fire with increased determination, momentarily halting the advance of Clayton's men. But it was a temporary reprieve at best. Reynolds' forces still outnumbered them significantly, and they had the advantage of cover from the wagons. It was only a matter of time before they reached the house. Martha felt a contraction ripple across her abdomen. Not labor, she was sure, but a warning from her body that the stress and exertion were taking their toll. She took a deep breath, willing the sensation to pass. Now was not the time for weakness. Samuel appeared at her side, his face streaked with gunpowder and sweat. "Mrs. Coleman, we can't hold them much longer. Maybe you should consider—" "I'm not leaving," Martha cut him off, her voice firm, despite the fear churning in her stomach. "This is my home, my land. I'll defend it to my last breath if necessary." The young banker looked like he wanted to argue, but another volley of gunfire from outside demanded their attention. Clayton's men had pushed one of the wagons to within 30 yards of the house, close enough for the men behind it to make a rush for the door if they chose. Martha aimed carefully at the exposed legs of one of the men, pushing the wagon, squeezing the trigger on her exhale as Thomas had taught her. The man fell with a cry. Another took his place almost immediately, but Martha's shot had bought them a few more precious seconds. The sound of hoofbeats, many horses approaching, fast reached her ears. For a moment, Martha's heart sank, thinking Clayton had somehow summoned even more reinforcements. But these riders were coming from the direction of town, not from the Reynolds ranch. As they crested the rise, Martha saw with astonishment that it was a posse, at least 15 men, led by a figure she recognized as the current sheriff of Rio Blanco, a young man named Harding, who had taken over when Ezra retired. The arrival of law enforcement changed the dynamic instantly. Clayton's men hesitated, unsure whether to continue their assault or retreat. Clayton himself wheeled his horse, shouting orders that were lost in the general confusion. Sheriff Harding's voice cut through the chaos. "Clayton Reynolds, you and your men are ordered to stand down immediately. You're all under arrest for attempted murder, assault, trespassing, and about a dozen other charges I haven't had time to list yet." A strange silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the nervous shuffling of horses. Clayton remained frozen for a moment, as if unable to comprehend this turn of events. Then, with a visible effort, he straightened in his saddle. "This is a private matter, Sheriff," he called back. "A land dispute between myself and Mrs. Coleman." "Land disputes don't involve 30 armed men and dynamite," Harding replied dryly. "Now order your men to drop their weapons, or we'll add resisting arrest to the charges." Clayton's face darkened with rage. For a tense moment, Martha thought he might actually order his men to fire on the sheriff's posse. But even Clayton Reynolds wasn't that far gone. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. "Stand down," he ordered his men, his voice tight with suppressed fury. One by one, Reynolds' men laid down their weapons. The sheriff's posse moved in, securing the surrendered arms and beginning the process of taking the attackers into custody. Martha sagged against the window frame, relief washing over her in a wave that left her weak-kneed. It was over. They had won. Samuel touched her arm gently. "Mrs. Coleman, are you all right?" Martha nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. After a moment, she managed, "How did the sheriff know to come?" "That would be my doing," said a voice from the doorway. Martha turned to see James Butler, the ranch hand, who had warned her about the attack. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and dust covering his clothes. "After I warned you, I rode straight for town," he explained. "Figured the sheriff should know what Clayton was planning. Took some convincing, and Ezra's name helped, but he finally agreed to gather a posse." Martha felt a surge of gratitude toward this man she barely knew. "Thank you," she said simply. "You risked a lot." Butler shrugged, uncomfortable with her thanks. "Just did what I should have done a year ago when your husband was killed." His eyes dropped to the floor. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find my conscience." Before Martha could respond, Abigail appeared from the kitchen, wiping blood from her hands with a cloth. "Your Apache friend is asking for you," she told Martha. "He's lost blood, but the wound isn't deep. He'll recover with rest." Martha moved quickly to the kitchen, her relief at the battle's end momentarily overshadowed by concern for Swift Shadow. He lay on the table where they had placed him, his upper body bare except for the bandage wrapped around his midsection. Despite his injury, he tried to sit up when Martha entered. "Lie still," she chided gently, moving to his side. "You'll start bleeding again." Swift Shadow subsided, but his dark eyes remained alert, scanning her face. "You are unharmed." "I'm fine," Martha assured him. "And it's over. The sheriff arrived with a posse. Clayton and his men have surrendered." A flicker of something relief perhaps crossed Swift Shadow's stoic features. "Good." He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "The land is safe. Your child's inheritance is secure." Martha felt tears prick at her eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, of emotions too complex to name. "Because of you. Because you kept your promise to Thomas." Swift Shadow shook his head slightly. "Because you fought for what was yours, only El helped." Martha wanted to argue, to tell him how much more than help he had provided, but footsteps in the doorway interrupted her. She turned to see Sheriff Harding, his badge gleaming on his chest hat in his hands. "Mrs. Coleman," he greeted her. "I'm sorry we couldn't get here sooner." Martha straightened, keeping her hand in Swift Shadow's. "You're here now, Sheriff. That's what matters." Harding nodded, his young face serious. "Clayton Reynolds and his son are in custody along with most of their men. Some got away in the confusion, but we'll round them up. He paused, then added, I've taken statements from Ezra and some of the others. With the evidence from the banker Holloway and testimony from Butler about your husband's murder, Clayton's looking at a long stay in territorial prison. Martha felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Justice for Thomas, it was more than she had dared to hope for. Thank you, Sheriff, she said. Harding shifted uncomfortably. There's something else you should know. When we were securing the prisoners, one of my deputies found this on Carter Reynolds. He held out a folded piece of paper. It's a telegram confirming that the railroad will definitely run through your property. The line's been approved and construction starts in the spring. Martha accepted the telegram, scanning its contents quickly. It was, as Harding had said, official confirmation that the Santa Fe line would extend a spur that crossed the corner of her ranch. The land value will increase tenfold overnight, the sheriff continued. And with the water rights, he trailed off, glancing at Swift Shadow. Well, let's just say you're sitting on one of the most valuable properties in the territory. Martha folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into her pocket. The land was already valuable to me, Sheriff. This doesn't change that. Harding nodded, seeming to understand. I'll need formal statements from everyone when things calm down. For now, I've left a couple of deputies to help with the wounded and keep an eye on things. He put his hat back on, preparing to leave. You fought bravely, Mrs. Coleman. Your husband would be proud. After the sheriff had gone, Martha turned back to Swift Shadow. The Apache warrior's eyes were heavy with fatigue, the blood loss and strain of the day finally catching up to him. Rest now, she told him softly. Everything else can wait. Swift Shadow's grip on her hand tightened briefly. I will stay, he murmured, his voice already fading as exhaustion claimed him. Until you are safe. Martha felt something shift inside her at his words, not the baby this time, but something deeper, more profound. A recognition, perhaps, of the bond that had formed between them through danger and shared purpose. I know, she whispered, though Swift Shadow had already drifted into sleep. I know you will. Outside, the sun had fully risen, bathing the ranch in golden light. The signs of battle were everywhere, churned earth, spent cartridges, bloodstains drying in the dust. But the land itself remained enduring, as it had for centuries before any of them had laid claim to it. Martha moved to the porch, needing a moment alone to process everything that had happened. She sat in the old rocking chair Thomas had made for her when they first moved to the ranch, her hand resting on her belly where their child grew. Ezra found her there a short time later, his weathered face showing the strain of the day, but his eyes clear and satisfied. Quite a morning, he commented, leaning against the porch rail. Martha smiled wearily. Quite a morning, she agreed. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as the sheriff's men and the ranch's defenders went about the business of treating the wounded and securing the property. What will you do now? Ezra asked eventually. With the railroad coming, you could sell the ranch for a small fortune. Move back east, give the child a different kind of life. Martha considered the question, her gaze drifting to the distant mountains, to the creek bed that would flow again when the rains returned to the small grave on the hill where Thomas rested. This is our home, she said simply. Jdayin and the babies. I won't leave it. Ezra nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. And Swift Shadow, will he stay too? Martha thought of the wounded warrior sleeping in her kitchen, of his promise to Thomas, of the way he had risked his life again and again to protect her and her land. I don't know, she admitted. His people need him too. Before Ezra could respond, Running Fox approached the porch. The old Apache warrior had a small cut on his forehead, but otherwise seemed unharmed by the battle. Martha Coleman, he greeted her formally. The water you promised, will you remember? Martha nodded, understanding what he was asking. When the creek flows again, your people will always have access. This I swear. Running Fox's weathered face creased in a rare smile. Then the land has chosen well its guardian. He glanced toward the kitchen where Swift Shadow rested. He will stay with you, I think, at least until the child comes. Martha felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. And you, your people. We will return to the mountains, Running Fox replied, but not far and not forever. He touched his heart, then gestured to the land around them. Some bonds cannot be broken by distance. As the old warrior walked away, Martha felt a sense of completion, of rightness. The battle was over. The land was secure. And whatever the future held, she would face it with the strength she had discovered within herself during these difficult days. The baby kicked as if in agreement with her thoughts. Martha smiled, patting her belly gently. "Yes, little one," she murmured. "This is our home, our land, and no one will ever take it from us again." The promise echoed in her heart as the sun climbed higher in the New Mexico sky, blessing the land with its golden light and the promise of a new beginning. End of part 1. The days following the battle for Martha Coleman's ranch unfolded in a blur of activity. Sheriff Harding and his deputies took formal statements from everyone involved documenting Clayton Reynolds' attack in meticulous detail. James Butler's testimony about Thomas Coleman's murder added murder charges to the already substantial list of crimes the wealthy rancher would face. For Martha, these developments brought a measure of justice she had hardly dared to hope for, but the practical challenges of restoring her ranch remained. The battle had left its scars on the land, trampled crops, damaged fences, bullet holes in the barn and house walls. Even with the help of those who had stood with her, the work of rebuilding would take time and resources she wasn't sure she had. 5 days after the battle, Martha sat at her kitchen table with Abigail Hayes discussing these very concerns. Swift's shadow lay on a makeshift bed in the corner, still recovering from his wound, but improving daily under Abigail's care. "The railroad money will help," Abigail noted, reviewing the preliminary offer the Santa Fe line had sent for the right-of-way across Martha's property. "But that won't come through for months." Martha nodded, her hand absently moving to her belly where the baby had been particularly active that morning. "And I need to repair the damage now before winter." Swift Shadow's voice, quiet but clear, came from his corner. "Your defenders will help. They fought for this land. They will not abandon it now." Martha glanced at him, noting the color returning to his face. The bullet wound had been more serious than they'd initially thought, not just a graze, but a deep furrow along his ribs that had become infected. For 2 days, he'd burned with fever, muttering in his native tongue, while Abigail worked tirelessly to bring the infection under control. "You should be resting," Martha chided gently, though she was relieved to hear strength returning to his voice. Swift Shadow made a dismissive gesture. "I have rested enough." He started to sit up, then winced, his hand going to his bandaged side. "Lie back down before you undo all my work." Abigail ordered, her tone brooking no argument. To Martha's surprise, Swift Shadow complied, though his dark eyes remained alert and focused. "The water," he said. "It is time to find it." Martha frowned, confused. "Find what water?" "The deep water, the aquifer." Swift Shadow's gaze was intense. "The drought continues. The creek is dried, but the water is there beneath the earth. Your husband knew where to look." Martha's mind went to Thomas's watch, to the numbers inscribed inside that had matched locations on his map. One of those locations, near the ruined Spanish mission, had been marked as a potential access point to the underground water. "Even if we could find it," she said, "we'd need equipment to drill a well. That costs money." "I may be able to help with that," came a voice from the doorway. Martha turned to see Samuel Holloway, the young banker who had brought the evidence of Clayton's fraudulent land documents. He looked different today, more confident, less nervous, as if the events of the past week had somehow transformed him. "Mr. Holloway," Martha greeted him, rising to offer him a chair. "What brings you out to the ranch?" Samuel sat, setting his hat on the table. "Two things, actually. First, the bank's board has authorized an emergency loan for repairs to your property." He slid a document across the table. "Low interest, favorable terms. They're eager to demonstrate their independence from Clayton Reynolds' influence." Martha scanned the paper, hardly believing what she was reading. The loan amount was generous, more than enough to repair the damage and make improvements she hadn't thought possible. "And the second thing?" she asked, looking up from the document. Samuel smiled, a hint of excitement in his eyes. "I've been researching your husband's notes on the aquifer. The Geological Survey Office in Santa Fe has records that seem to confirm his theories. There's a substantial underground water source running beneath this valley, and one of the main access points appears to be on your property." Abigail leaned forward, her weathered face intent. "The veins of the Earth Mother," she murmured. "My people have known of them for generations." Samuel nodded. "The survey office is sending an engineer next week with drilling equipment. If we can tap into the aquifer—" He didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the implications. In drought-stricken New Mexico territory, reliable water was more valuable than gold. A proven well that tapped into a major aquifer would make Martha's land among the most valuable in the region, quite apart from the railroad access. "Clayton knew," Martha said softly. "That's why he was so determined to have this land." Yes, Samuel agreed, and why he was willing to kill for it. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only when Swift Shadow spoke again. The water does not belong to any one person. It is a gift from the earth meant to be shared. Martha met his gaze, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. Yes, she agreed, and it will be. The next days brought a steady stream of visitors to the ranch. Ezra Sullivan arrived with tools and lumber, leading a group of men from town who had volunteered to help with repairs. Running Fox and several other Apache came down from the hills bringing game for the pot and offering their labor. Even James Butler returned, having officially quit his position at the Double R Ranch to help rebuild the barn. Martha was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. These people had already risked their lives to defend her home. Now they were giving their time and effort to restore it. Their generosity touched her deeply, reinforcing her commitment to this land and the community that had formed around it. Swift Shadow recovered enough to move about, though Abigail restricted him to light duties. Martha often found him sitting on the porch, whittling small wooden animals or speaking quietly with Running Fox in their native tongue. Sometimes he would watch her as she directed the repairs or tended to her small garden, his dark eyes unreadable, yet somehow comforting in their constancy. One evening, as the workers were departing for the day, Martha joined Swift Shadow on the porch. The setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, turning the distant mountains into silhouettes against the darkening sky. "They work hard," Swift Shadow observed, nodding toward the departing men, "because they believe in what you fight for." Martha sank into the rocking chair beside him, one hand resting on her growing belly. "I'm grateful for their help. I couldn't have managed alone." Swift Shadow was silent for a moment, his gaze on the horizon. "No one survives alone," he said finally. "Not truly. We all need others, though some are slow to learn this." There was something in his tone that made Martha wonder if he was speaking from personal experience. "Is that why you left the army?" she asked him carefully. "To find your people again." A shadow crossed Swift Shadow's face. "I left because I saw what the army truly wanted. Not peace, not understanding. Control, submission." His hands stilled on the piece of wood he was carving. "I led them to Apache camps, believing their promises of fair treatment. Instead, they brought death." Martha felt a chill despite the evening warmth. "I'm sorry." Swift Shadow shook his head slightly. "It was long ago, another life." He resumed his carving, the knife moving with precise, controlled strokes. "Your husband, he understood the value of the land, of the water beneath it." "Yes," Martha agreed, grateful for the change of subject. "Thomas always said this place was special, that we were just its caretakers, not its owners." A wise man. Swift Shadow examined his carving, a small horse perfectly proportioned despite its size. "The child will need to know these things, to understand the responsibility that comes with the land." Martha's hand moved in a slow circle over her belly, feeling the baby's movements beneath her palm. "I'll teach him or her everything Thomas would have wanted them to know." Swift Shadow nodded, seemingly satisfied. He held out the carved horse, offering it to Martha. "For the child," he said simply. Martha accepted the gift, touched by the gesture. The wood was smooth and warm from his hands, the detail remarkable in something so small. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's beautiful." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, each lost in their own thoughts. The night was peaceful, the stars emerging one by one in the vast New Mexico sky. It was hard to believe that just days ago, this same land had been a battlefield. The baby kicked a strong, decisive movement that made Martha smile. "Active tonight," she commented. Swift Shadow glanced at her, a hint of curiosity in his normally stoic expression. "How much longer?" "About 2 months, Dr. Wilson thinks." Martha shifted in the chair, trying to find a more comfortable position. "Though he says first babies often come late." Swift Shadow's gaze returned to the darkening landscape. "I will stay until then," he said, his tone making it a statement rather than a question. "To ensure you and the child are safe." Martha felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. "I'd like that," she admitted. The moment was interrupted by the sound of an approaching wagon. Martha tensed instinctively, the memories of battle still fresh, but Swift Shadow's calm demeanor reassured her. "It is the old woman," he said, his keen eyes making out details in the gathering darkness that Martha couldn't discern. "And the banker." Sure enough, Abigail's wagon soon pulled up to the ranch house, Samuel Holloway handling the reins. They had gone to town earlier that day to send telegrams to the railroad company in the Geological Survey office. Martha Abigail called as Samuel helped her down from the wagon seat. "We have news." Martha rose to meet them, curious about the excitement in Abigail's voice. "Good news, I hope." "The best." Samuel confirmed, his face alight with enthusiasm. "The survey engineer is arriving tomorrow, not next week, and he's bringing a full drilling crew with him." Martha's heart leapt. "So soon?" "Apparently the territorial governor has taken an interest in your case," Abigail explained, her eyes twinkling. "Word of Clayton Reynolds' crimes has spread, and the government is eager to demonstrate that justice applies to the powerful as well as the common folk." "There's more," Samuel added. "The railroad has increased their offer for the right-of-way, substantially." He handed Martha a telegram, his smile widening. "They're very interested in securing water access for their steam engines." Martha scanned the telegram, her eyes widening at the figure quoted. It was 3 times the original offer, enough to secure the ranch's future for years to come. "This is, incredible," she managed, looking up from the paper. Abigail patted her arm. "It's what Thomas would have wanted. The land recognized for its true value, but still in the hands of those who understand its worth beyond mere dollars." Later that night, after Abigail and Samuel had departed with promises to return the next day for the survey engineer's arrival, Martha found herself unable to sleep. The baby was restless, and her mind was too full of the day's developments to find peace. She rose from her bed and moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. Her ranch, her home, looked different somehow, as if the recent events had transformed it just as they had transformed her. A movement in the yard caught her attention. Swift shadow. A shadow among shadows, walking slowly around the perimeter of the property. Even wounded, he maintained his vigil, keeping his promise to protect her and the land. Martha watched him for a moment, then returned to her bed, suddenly overcome with weariness. As she drifted towards sleep, her hand resting on her belly where her child grew, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since Thomas's death. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. But for now, in this moment, all was well. The Geological Survey engineer, Harold Prescott, arrived at Martha's ranch shortly after breakfast the next morning. He was a small, energetic man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard, clearly excited about the prospect of discovering a major aquifer. "Mrs. Coleman," he greeted Martha, pumping her hand enthusiastically. "A pleasure to meet you. I've studied your husband's notes. Remarkable work for an amateur geologist. Quite remarkable." Martha smiled, a little taken aback by his energy, but warming to his obvious passion for his work. Thomas was always interested in the land, how it formed, what lay beneath it. "A man after my own heart," Prescott declared. He turned to survey the property, his expert eye taking in the topography. "Now, according to your husband's map, the most promising access point is near the old Spanish mission. Ruins, yes." Martha nodded. "About a mile east of here, where the dry creek bed begins." Prescott's drilling crew, a team of 4 weathered men who clearly knew their business, had already begun unloading equipment from the wagons they'd brought. The drilling apparatus looked complicated and impressive, with steel components that glinted in the morning sun. Swift Shadow appeared silently at Martha's side, his presence drawing Prescott's curious gaze. "Ah, and you must be the Apache scout I've heard about," the engineer said, offering his hand. "Samuel Holloway mentioned your contribution to protecting Mrs. Coleman's property." Swift Shadow accepted the handshake with a reserved nod. "The land is worth protecting." "Indeed it is," Prescott agreed heartily. "Especially if your husband's theories prove correct, Mrs. Coleman. An untapped aquifer of this size would be a significant discovery for the territory." They set off for the mission ruins, Martha riding in a wagon with Abigail, while the men walked alongside. Swift Shadow moved with a slight stiffness that betrayed his healing wound, but he refused all suggestions that he should rest. The ruins themselves were modest, crumbling adobe walls, the remnants of what had once been a chapel, and a dried-up fountain in what had been the central courtyard. The Spanish missionaries had abandoned the site nearly a century earlier, leaving it to the mercy of the elements and time. "Perfect spot for a well," Prescott declared, examining the fountain. The missionaries had good instincts for water. They likely chose this location because they sensed the aquifer below, even if they didn't understand the geology of it. The drilling crew set up their equipment with practiced efficiency, positioning the drill over the old fountain. Prescott explained that they would bore through the stone base where the original well had likely been located. If your husband's calculations are correct, he told Martha, we should hit water within 50 feet or so. That's unusually shallow for an aquifer of this type, which is what makes this location so valuable. Martha watched the preparations with a mixture of hope and anxiety. What if Thomas had been wrong? What if the water wasn't there or was too deep to reach with their equipment? So much now depended on finding this underground river. Swift Shadow stood nearby, his expression unreadable as he observed the drilling crew. But when Martha caught his eye, he gave her a slight nod and as if to reassure her that all would be well. The drilling began with a mechanical clanking that echoed off the ruined walls. Martha, Abigail, and the others retreated to a shady spot to watch the process, which Prescott warned might take several hours. Boring through rock is slow work, he explained, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. But if the water's there, we'll find it. As they waited, Samuel Holloway arrived from town with news that sent a ripple of excitement through the group. Clayton and Carter Reynolds have been formally charged, he announced. Murder, fraud, attempted murder, and a host of lesser crimes. The territorial judge has denied bail for both of them. Martha felt a complex mixture of emotions at this new satisfaction that justice was being served, a relief that the Reynolds were securely imprisoned, and a tinge of sadness that things had come to such an end. What will happen to their ranch? She asked. Samuel adjusted his spectacles. That's still being determined. The bank has a claim on it due to outstanding loans, but there are questions about whether those loans were properly secured given the fraudulent nature of some of the land documents. And the people who work there, Martha pressed, thinking of the many hands who depended on the Double R for their livelihood. For now, the foreman is managing day-to-day operations, Samuel assured her. No one's losing their job while the legal issues are sorted out. This news relieved Martha's immediate concern, but raised questions about the future. The Double R was the largest ranch in the region, employing dozens of men and controlling vast tracts of land. What would happen to the balance of power in the valley if it changed hands or was broken up? Before she could pursue this line of thought, a shout from the drilling site drew everyone's attention. We've hit something, one of the crew called. Prescott hurried over, his face alight with excitement. Martha and the others followed as quickly as her condition allowed. The drill had penetrated about 40 feet when it encountered a layer of rock different from the surrounding strata. Prescott examined the samples the crew had brought him up, his expression growing more animated by the moment. Limestone, he exclaimed. Water-bearing limestone, we're close, very close. The crew resumed drilling with renewed energy. Martha found herself holding her breath as the drill bit deeper into the earth. Swift Shadow stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. It happened suddenly. The drill dropped several inches as it broke through the limestone layer, and water began to flow up around the shaft, clear and cold. We've done it, Prescott shouted, practically dancing with excitement. We've tapped the aquifer. The water flow increased rapidly, soon becoming a steady stream that spilled over the ancient fountain and began to fill the long, dry basin. The drilling crew cheered, slapping each other on the back in congratulation. Martha watched in awe as the water that had been flowing beneath her land, all this time unseen but present, caught the sunlight and sparkled. Thomas had been right. His research, his careful mapping, had led them to this moment. Swift Shadow dipped his hand into the flowing water, bringing it to his lips to taste. Sweet, he pronounced. Pure. The old ones knew of this place. Prescott was taking measurements and making notes, his scientific enthusiasm unabated. The flow rate is remarkable, he told Martha. This isn't just a well, it's an artesian spring. The pressure in the aquifer is forcing the water up naturally. You won't need pumps or windmills to access it. The implications were staggering. Not only had they found water, but they had found it in a form that was accessible without expensive equipment or ongoing maintenance. We'll need to cap it properly, of course. Prescott continued, already planning the next steps. Install pipes to direct the flow where you want it. But essentially, Mrs. Coleman, you now have an unlimited water supply in the middle of one of the driest regions in the territory. Martha felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, vindication, and a deep sense that Thomas was somehow present, witnessing this moment of discovery. Her hand went to her belly where the baby kicked, as if sharing in the excitement. The creek, she said suddenly. Could we divert some of the flow to restore the creek bed? Prescott considered this, nodding slowly. Absolutely. With the proper channeling, you could reestablish the entire watershed. it would transform the valley. Abigail, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, came to stand beside Martha. "The veins of the Earth Mother," she murmured, flowing once more. The water continued to rise in the old fountain, now nearly filling the basin. Its clarity was remarkable. Martha could see the worn stone patterns at the bottom, hidden for decades beneath dust and debris, but now revealed by the flowing water. Swift Shadow moved to Martha's side, his voice low and meant for her alone. "Your husband's legacy," he said. "Water in a dry land, life where there was none." Martha nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This was indeed Thomas's legacy, not just to her and their child, but to the entire valley. Water that would nurture crops, sustain livestock, allow communities to thrive. And with that realization came clarity about her own path forward. As the excitement over the discovery continued around her, Martha made a decision. This water, this precious resource, would not be hoarded or used for personal gain alone. It would be shared as Swift Shadow had said it should be, as Thomas would have wanted. The following days were a flurry of activity as Prescott's crew installed proper pipes and channels to control the flow from the newly discovered spring. They diverted a portion of the water to rejuvenate the creek bed, which had been dry for nearly a year due to the drought. Within days, water was flowing along the old watercourse, bringing life back to the parched land. Word of the discovery spread quickly throughout the valley. Ranchers and farmers who had been struggling with the drought came to see the miracle for themselves. Martha, remembering her promise to Running Fox, made it clear that access to the water would be shared with all who needed it. "There will be a fair system," she announced at an impromptu gathering at her ranch. "No one owns the water itself, it belongs to the land. But we'll establish reasonable usage rights that ensure everyone has what they need without depleting the resource." This declaration was met with approval from most, though a few of the larger landowners grumbled about socialist notions. But with Clayton Reynolds' corrupt influence removed from the valley, a new spirit of cooperation began to emerge. Samuel Holloway, showing unexpected leadership, helped draft a water-sharing agreement that all local ranchers and farmers could sign. Ezra Sullivan lent his respected voice to the effort, encouraging the community to embrace this new approach. Through it all, Swift Shadow remained at Martha's side, his quiet presence a source of strength as she navigated these changes. His wound healed gradually, and with each passing day, he took on more responsibilities around the ranch, working alongside the hired hands Martha had been able to employ, thanks to the railroad payment. One evening, about 2 weeks after the discovery of the spring, Martha found Swift Shadow at the creek, watching the flowing water with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" she said, joining him on the bank. "How quickly life returns when water flows." He nodded, gesturing to the green shoots already emerging along the waterway. The seeds were always there waiting. They only needed the chance to grow. Martha lowered herself carefully to sit beside him, her advanced pregnancy making such movements increasingly awkward. The baby was due in just a few weeks now, and her body felt heavy and unwieldy. "Like people," she mused, picking up his metaphor, "we all have potential within us waiting for the right conditions to flourish." Swift Shadow glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his dark eyes. "Yes," he agreed, "though some never receive what they need to grow." Martha sensed he was speaking from personal experience again. "You found your purpose here," she observed, "helping to protect the land, the water." He was silent for a moment, his gaze returning to the flowing creek. "Perhaps," he conceded finally, "or perhaps I am still searching." They sat in companionable silence as the sun began to set, painting the landscape in warm hues of gold and amber. The water caught the light, turning briefly to liquid fire before shadows crept across its surface. "Will you return to your people?" Martha asked, voicing the question that had been in her mind for days. "When the baby comes, when you are fully healed?" Swift Shadow didn't answer immediately, his expression thoughtful. "Running Fox believes I am where I should be," he said finally, "that my path led me here for a reason." "And what do you believe?" Martha pressed gently. He turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I believe in the promise I made to your husband, to protect you and the child." He paused, then added, "But it has become more than a promise now. It has become a choice." Martha felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. "I'm glad," she said simply. Before Swift Shadow could respond, a rider appeared on the rise above the creek, James Butler, moving at a pace that suggested urgency. Martha rose awkwardly to her feet, Swift Shadow quickly moving to assist her. "Mrs. Coleman," Butler called as he reined in his horse nearby. "Swift Shadow, you're needed back at the ranch. Sheriff Harding's there with news." They made their way back quickly, Martha riding double with Butler, while Swift Shadow ran alongside with the ground-eating lope that had earned him his name. By the time they reached the ranch house, Martha could see Sheriff Harding's horse tied at the hitching post and Ezra Sullivan's wagon in the yard. The sheriff and Ezra were waiting on the porch, their expressions grave. Martha felt a chill of apprehension as she approached. "What's happened?" she asked without preamble. Sheriff Harding removed his hat, a gesture that only increased Martha's sense of foreboding. "It's Clayton Reynolds," he said. "He's dead." Martha blinked, the news so unexpected that for a moment she couldn't process it. "Dead how?" "Hanged himself in his cell last night," the sheriff explained. "Used his own belt. The guard found him this morning." Martha sank onto the porch bench, one hand going to her belly, where the baby had begun to kick vigorously as if sensing her distress. "And Carter?" "Still in custody," Harding assured her, "under close watch now, given what his father did." Ezra sat beside Martha, his weathered face solemn. "There's more," he said. "Clayton left a confession. Full details of Thomas's murder, the land fraud, everything." "A confession?" Martha echoed. "Why would he suddenly confess after denying everything for so long?" Sheriff Harding and Ezra exchanged a look. "That's the strange part," the sheriff said. "According to the note he left, he'd been planning to take these secrets to his grave. But he had a visitor yesterday, a priest from Santa Fe who was passing through. After the priest left, Clayton asked for paper and pen, wrote out his confession, and then—" He trailed off, the conclusion obvious. Swift Shadow, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "What priest?" The sheriff shrugged. "No one seems to know much about him. The jail guard remembers he wore the proper robes, spoke with a Spanish accent. Said his name was Father Miguel." Martha glanced at Swift Shadow, noting the sudden intensity in his expression. "You know something," she said, not a question, but a statement. Swift Shadow's gaze met hers. "There is no priest from Santa Fe named Father Miguel," he said quietly. "At least none that travels this route." Sheriff Harding frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing," Swift Shadow replied. "Merely an observation." But Martha could tell there was more to it than that. Something about this mysterious priest had triggered a reaction in Swift Shadow, though she couldn't guess what it might be. The sheriff departed soon after, leaving a copy of Clayton's confession with Martha. It was several pages of cramped handwriting detailing decades of fraud, coercion, and occasionally violence in Clayton's rise to power in the valley. Later that evening, after Ezra had gone and the ranch had settled into its nighttime routine, Martha found Swift Shadow on the porch staring out at the darkened landscape. "You know who the priest was, don't you?" she asked directly. Swift Shadow was silent for a long moment. Then, without turning to look at her, he said, "There are those among my people who can influence others, make them see their own actions clearly without the lies they tell themselves." Martha considered this. "You're saying an Apache visited Clayton in the guise of a priest, made him confess somehow?" Swift Shadow shook his head slightly. "I am saying that justice finds its way sometimes by unexpected paths." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Clayton Reynolds had much to answer for. Now he has answered." Martha wasn't sure what to make of this cryptic response, but she sensed she wouldn't get a clear answer. "Well, whatever the truth of it, his confession has cleared Thomas's name completely. There can be no doubt now that he was murdered for discovering Clayton's fraud." Swift Shadow nodded. "Your husband was an honorable man. He deserved to have the truth known." The baby kicked sharply, causing Martha to wince. Swift Shadow noticed immediately, concern replacing the inscrutability of his expression. "The child is restless tonight," he observed. Martha smiled, placing a hand on her belly. "Very. Dr. Wilson says it won't be much longer, now perhaps a week or two at most." Swift Shadow's gaze dropped to her rounded abdomen. "The child will be born in a time of change. With the water flowing, the railroad coming, the old power broken." "A new beginning," Martha agreed, "for all of us." They stood together in companionable silence, watching as the moon rose over the distant mountains, its silver light transforming the landscape into a realm of shadows and mysteries. The newly flowing creek caught the moonlight, a ribbon of silver winding through the darkness. Martha felt a deep sense of peace, despite the lingering questions about Clayton's death and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Whatever came next, she was no longer alone in facing it. The following days brought a flurry of developments in the wake of Clayton Reynolds' death. His confession, now public knowledge, sent shockwaves through the territory. Families who had lost land to the Reynolds empire over the years came forward with their stories, creating a complex legal tangle that would take months, if not years, to fully resolve. Carter Reynolds, still in custody awaiting trial, found himself facing not only charges related to Thomas Coleman's murder and the attack on Martha's ranch, but also the prospect of inheriting his father's legal problems, along with the remains of his empire. For Martha, these events unfolded at a distance, her attention increasingly focused on her imminent childbirth. Her body felt heavy and unwieldy, the baby having dropped lower in preparation for delivery. Dr. Wilson visited more frequently now, assuring her that everything was progressing normally, while gently suggesting she limit her activities. "The child will come when it's ready," he told her during his latest examination. "But in the meantime, you need to rest, Mrs. Coleman. The body prepares for birth in its own way, and pushing yourself too hard can complicate matters." Martha tried to follow his advice, though sitting idle went against her nature. Swift Shadow seemed to understand her restlessness better than most, finding small tasks she could manage from a seated position, shelling peas for dinner, mending clothes, or sorting through the ranch's account books. He had taken on more responsibilities around the property, working alongside the two hands Martha had hired with the railroad money. His wound had healed well, leaving only a puckered scar along his ribs as evidence of the battle. The Apache warriors who had fought alongside them visited, occasionally bringing game or news from the hills, but Swift Shadow remained a constant presence at the ranch. One warm afternoon, as Martha sat on the porch shelling peas, Abigail Hayes arrived in her wagon looking unusually excited. "You'll never guess what's happening in town," she announced, settling into the chair beside Martha. "They're talking about renaming the settlement. Rio Blanco is too common, they say. Half a dozen towns in the territory have the same name." Martha raised an eyebrow, amused by the old woman's enthusiasm for town gossip. "And what would they call it instead? Coleman Spring," Abigail said with a triumphant smile. "After Thomas and the water he helped discover." Martha's hands stilled on the peas. "They want to name the town after Thomas." "And you," Abigail confirmed. "The council's voting on it next week. Samuel Holloway's leading the charge, says it's a fitting tribute to what your family has done for the valley." Martha felt a complex mixture of emotions, pride, humility, a renewed sense of loss for Thomas, who wouldn't see this recognition of his work. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Abigail advised. "Thomas deserved this honor, and so do you. The water you've shared has already begun to change things. Crops that were failing are recovering. Livestock that was being sold off for lack of grazing can stay." She patted Martha's hand. "Your generosity has saved this valley. The least they can do is put your name on it." Later that evening, Martha shared the news with Swift Shadow as they sat together after dinner. The Knights had developed a pleasant routine. They would eat together, then sit on the porch if the weather was fair, or by the fire if it wasn't, talking quietly about the day's events. "Coleman Spring," Swift Shadow repeated, considering the name. "It has meaning. Water and family together." Martha nodded, her hand resting on her belly where the baby had been unusually quiet that day. "It still feels strange to have our name on the town. I'm not sure Thomas would have wanted that kind of recognition." "Some honors come whether sought or not," Swift Shadow observed. "Your husband's discovery has brought life back to a dying land. That deserves to be remembered." Martha smiled, appreciating his perspective. "When you put it that way, it does seem fitting." She shifted in her chair, trying to find a comfortable position. Her back had been aching dully all day, a discomfort Dr. Wilson had assured her was normal in the final weeks of pregnancy. Swift Shadow noticed her discomfort. "You are in pain." "Just the usual aches," Martha assured him. "Dr. Wilson says it's to be expected." Swift Shadow studied her for a moment, then rose and disappeared into the house. He returned with a small pouch of herbs similar to those he had given her when they first met. "For the pain," he explained, handing her the pouch. "Brew it as tea. It will help without harming the child." Martha accepted the gift gratefully. "Thank you for this and for everything else. I don't know how I would have managed these past weeks without your help." A hint of what might have been a smile touched Swift Shadow's normally stoic features. "I made a promise," he said, "to your husband and to myself." Martha wanted to ask what he meant by the second part, but a sudden sharp pain in her lower back drove the question from her mind. She gasped, her hand going to her belly. Swift Shadow was immediately alert. "What is it?" "Nothing," Martha said automatically, then reconsidered as the pain subsided. "Or perhaps something. Dr. Wilson said false labor pains are common near the end." Swift Shadow didn't look convinced. "Should I fetch the doctor?" Martha shook her head. "Not yet. If it happens again or gets worse, then perhaps." They sat in silence for a time, Martha focusing on her breathing as occasional twinges of discomfort came and went. The night deepened around them, stars appearing one by one in the vast New Mexico sky. Just as Martha was beginning to think the pains had been a false alarm, a stronger contraction gripped her, this one unmistakable in its intensity. She gripped the arms of her chair, a small sound escaping her despite her attempt to remain calm. Swift Shadow was on his feet instantly. "I will get the doctor," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Martha nodded, unable to speak until the contraction passed. "Yes," she managed finally. "And Abigail, if you can find her, she's experienced with childbirth." Swift Shadow was already moving toward the stable. "I will bring them both. Rest. Do not move unless you must." Martha watched him go, a mixture of fear and anticipation rising within her. The baby was coming, perhaps not immediately, but soon. Within hours, she would meet the child she and Thomas had created together, the new life that had sustained her through the darkest days after his death. Another contraction came stronger than the last. Martha breathed through it as best she could, remembering what Abigail had told her about childbirth. When it passed, she made her way carefully inside to her bedroom, knowing she should prepare for what was to come. The contractions continued as she changed into a nightgown and tried to make herself comfortable on the bed. They were still relatively far apart, 15 minutes or more, but their intensity was increasing steadily. Time seemed to stretch and compress strangely as Martha waited alone with the rhythmic pain of her body preparing to bring new life into the world. She thought of Thomas, wishing desperately that he could be with her for this moment. She thought of her own mother, long dead, whose face she could barely remember. And she thought unexpectedly of Swift Shadow, whose strength and quiet support had become so essential to her life. The sound of approaching horses roused Martha from these reflections. Swift Shadow had returned, and quickly he must have ridden like the wind to reach town and back in such a short time. Voices in the main room, footsteps approaching her door. Then Dr. Wilson was there, his kind face serious as he assessed her condition. Abigail followed, her practical energy filling the room as she began organizing what they would need. "How far apart are the pains?" the doctor asked, washing his hands in the basin Abigail had prepared. "About 10 minutes now," Martha told him, "but getting stronger." Dr. Wilson nodded. "First babies often take their time. We'll make you comfortable and wait for nature to take its course." Swift Shadow appeared briefly in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and something Martha couldn't quite identify. "I will be outside," he said. "If you need anything." Abigail shooed him away. "This is women's business now," she declared. "You men make yourselves useful elsewhere." The hours that followed were a blur of pain and waiting for Martha. The contractions intensified, coming closer together as the night deepened. Dr. Wilson checked her progress periodically, his manner calm and reassuring. Abigail kept cool cloths on Martha's forehead, murmuring encouragement and practical advice. Outside, Martha could occasionally hear Swift Shadow moving about the ranch, checking on the livestock, keeping the lamps filled, maintaining a vigil of his own as she labored to bring new life into the world. Near dawn, when the first pale light was just beginning to touch the eastern sky, Martha's labor intensified dramatically. The contractions came one after another, now barely giving her time to catch her breath between them. "It's time," Dr. Wilson announced after examining her. "The baby's ready to be born. With the next pain, I want you to push Martha." Martha nodded, gathering her strength. When the next contraction came, she pushed with all her might, crying out with the effort. Again and again she pushed, following the doctor's instructions, Abigail's strong hand supporting her back. "I can see the head," Dr. Wilson said encouragingly. "One more good push." Martha summoned her last reserves of strength. With a final tremendous effort, she felt the baby slip from her body, and then the most beautiful sound she had ever heard filled the room, the strong, indignant cry of her newborn child. "A girl!" Wilson announced, his voice warm with happiness. "A healthy baby girl." Tears filled Martha's eyes as the doctor placed the tiny red-faced infant on her chest. Her daughter hers, and Thomas's squirmed and cried, her little fists waving in protest at the bright, cold world she had entered. "She's perfect," Martha whispered, counting fingers and toes, marveling at the miniature features that somehow combined her own and Thomas's. Abigail beamed, her weathered face alight with joy. "She's strong," the old woman declared, "a fighter like her mother." Dr. Wilson efficiently completed the delivery process, ensuring both mother and child were stable and well. Once he was satisfied, he began packing his bag. "I'll come back this afternoon to check on you both," he promised. "But everything looks excellent. You did wonderfully, Martha." After the doctor had gone, Abigail helped Martha clean up and change into a fresh nightgown. The baby, now swaddled in a soft blanket, lay in a cradle that Swift Shadow had made during the final weeks of Martha's pregnancy, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship with intricate carvings along the rails. "Should I tell him he can come in?" Abigail asked, nodding toward the door, where Swift Shadow had appeared periodically throughout the night, his concern evident despite his attempt to maintain his usual stoic demeanor. Martha nodded, suddenly eager to share this moment with him. "Yes, please." Abigail opened the door and spoke quietly. A moment later, Swift Shadow entered the room, his dark eyes immediately going to the small bundle in the cradle. For once, his impassive expression failed him. Martha could see the wonder and tenderness that transformed his features as he beheld the newborn. "A daughter," Martha told him, her voice hoarse from the exertions of labor, but filled with pride. "Healthy and strong." Swift Shadow approached the cradle slowly, almost reverently. "She is beautiful," he said simply, "like her mother." Martha felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the physical aftermath of childbirth. "Would you like to hold her?" Surprise flickered across Swift Shadow's face. "I have never held a newborn." "There's nothing to it," Abigail assured him, already lifting the baby from her cradle. "Support her head like so." She demonstrated, then carefully transferred the infant to Swift Shadow's arms. He stood motionless, cradling the tiny form with infinite care. The baby, who had been fussing, slightly quieted, immediately seeming content in his strong, gentle hold. Martha watched them, struck by the picture they made, the warrior and the newborn's strength protecting innocence. It felt right somehow that Swift Shadow should be among the first to hold her daughter, this man who had risked so much to protect them both. "Have you chosen a name?" Swift Shadow asked, his eyes still on the baby's face. Martha had been considering names for months, but in this moment, looking at her daughter in Swift Shadow's arms, she knew with certainty what the child should be called. "Hope," she said softly. "Her name is Hope Coleman." Swift Shadow nodded, a rare smile transforming his face. "A good name, strong like water in a dry land." Abigail made a sound of approval. "Hope," she repeated. "Yes, that suits her perfectly." The baby Hope stirred in Swift Shadow's arms, her tiny face scrunching up as she prepared to cry. Expertly, he shifted his hold, rocking her gently until she settled again. "You're a natural," Martha observed, surprised. A shadow crossed Swift Shadow's face. "I had a son once," he said quietly. "Long ago." The simple statement, delivered without elaboration, opened a window into his past that Martha had not glimpsed before. She wanted to ask more, but sensed that this was all he was prepared to share in this moment. "Thank you," she said instead, "for everything, for being here." Swift Shadow met her gaze, something deep and unspoken passing between them. "I am where I should be," he said simply. Abigail, with the sensitivity of age and experience, murmured something about preparing breakfast and slipped from the room, leaving them alone with the newborn. Swift Shadow carefully returned Hope to her mother's arms. The baby nuzzled against Martha's chest, instinctively seeking nourishment. With a confidence born of Abigail's practical instruction, Martha guided her daughter to her breast. The sensation of the tiny mouth latching on was strange but wonderful, a new bond forming between them. "I will let you rest," Swift Shadow said, moving toward the door. "Call if you need anything." "Wait," Martha said, looking up from her nursing daughter. "Will you stay? Just for a while?" Swift Shadow hesitated, then nodded, settling into the chair beside her bed. They sat in companionable silence, the only sounds Hope's soft nursing and the occasional creak of the old house settling in the morning warmth. Outside, the sun rose fully over the New Mexico landscape, illuminating a world transformed by flowing water and new beginnings. In the distance, the creek that Thomas had mapped and Swift Shadow had helped restore gurgled, happily on its course, bringing life to the land it touched. And in a simple bedroom on a small ranch that had become the center of so much change, A mother and her newborn daughter rested under the watchful eye of a warrior who had found, unexpectedly, a new purpose and perhaps even a new home. Hope Coleman, born on the morning tide of a new era for the valley, slept peacefully, unaware of the legacy she had inherited or the future that awaited her, a future shaped by water, by struggle, and by the enduring power of promises kept. The days following Hope's birth passed in a blur of exhaustion and joy for Martha. The tiny, perfect being who had lived beneath her heart for 9 months was now a separate entity, demanding and receiving constant attention. Abigail stayed at the ranch, her practical experience with infants proving invaluable as Martha navigated the challenges of new motherhood. Swift Shadow maintained a respectful distance, handling the ranch chores with quiet efficiency, but always available when needed. He seemed fascinated by Hope, often pausing in his work to watch her when he thought Martha wouldn't notice. There was something in his expression during these moments, a softness, a vulnerability that revealed more about the man than any words could have done. One week after the birth, Running Fox and several other Apache from his band visited the ranch bringing gifts for the newborn. A tiny pair of moccasins, exquisitely beaded. A small deerskin pouch containing sacred herbs for protection. A blanket woven with symbols of strength and long life. The child born of water will walk with blessing, Running Fox said solemnly, looking down at Hope as she slept in her cradle. Both worlds flow in her future. Martha, still weak from childbirth, but recovering well, thanked him for the gifts and for his continued friendship. "The creek is flowing again," she told him. "As I promised, your people will always have access to the water." Running Fox nodded, satisfied. "The land remembers those who honor it." He glanced at Swift Shadow, who stood nearby, "and those who protect its guardians." There was something significant in the exchange between the two Apache men, a question in Running Fox's eyes, an answer in Swift Shadow's slight nod. Martha sensed a decision had been made or confirmed, though she couldn't guess what it might be. After Running Fox and his people departed, Martha found herself alone with Swift Shadow for the first time since Hope's birth. Abigail had gone to town for supplies, and the ranch hands were working in the distant fields. "Running Fox spoke to you of something important," Martha observed as they sat together on the porch, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I could see it in your faces." Swift Shadow was silent for a moment, his gaze on the distant mountains. "He asked if I had found my path," he said finally, "if I would return to the people." Martha's heart beat faster, though she kept her voice even. "And what did you tell him?" "That my path has led me here." Swift Shadow turned to look at her directly. "That I have made promises I intend to keep." Martha felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "The promise to Thomas," she said softly. "Yes." Swift Shadow's dark eyes held hers. "And other promises. To myself. To the land." A pause, then almost inaudibly, "To you and the child." Before Martha could respond, Hope stirred and began to fuss, her tiny face scrunching up as she prepared to cry. Swift Shadow reached out gently, stroking the baby's cheek with one finger. Hope turned toward the touch, her cries subsiding into curious coos. "She knows you can," Martha observed, smiling at the baby's response. "She knows safety." Swift Shadow corrected, though a hint of pleasure showed in his eyes. "Children sense such things even when they have no words for them." Martha adjusted her hold on Hope, who was beginning to root against her chest, seeking nourishment. "Would you hold her while I prepare to feed her?" Swift Shadow nodded, accepting the tiny bundle with now practiced ease. Hope settled immediately in his arms, her dark eyes, so like Thomas's, focusing on his face with an intensity that seemed impossible for a newborn. "She sees you," Martha said softly, watching them together. "Truly sees you." A rare smile touched Swift Shadow's lips. "Perhaps she does." He cradled Hope, gently supporting her head with a natural instinct that spoke of experience. Children see truth more clearly than adults. They have not yet learned to look away from what is real. Martha arranged herself more comfortably, then held out her arms to receive her daughter back. As Swift Shadow carefully transferred Hope to her, their hands touched briefly, a moment of connection that sent a subtle current through Martha's body. She busied herself with positioning Hope at her breast, using the task to collect her thoughts. These feelings that had been growing within her, admiration, gratitude, and something deeper, more complex, were both welcome and unsettling. Thomas had been gone for over a year, but in some ways the wound of his loss still felt fresh. And yet life continued. Hope's birth had made that abundantly clear. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities that Martha was only beginning to consider. Swift shadow, she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say, but feeling that something needed to be spoken. He waited, his dark eyes patient, giving her time to find her words. I want you to know, Martha continued carefully, that you have a place here, not just because of your promise to Thomas, but because of who you are, what you've become to. She hesitated, then finished, to us, to Hope and me. Swift Shadow was still for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then with deliberate care he reached out and touched Hope's small hand. The baby's fingers curled reflexively around his larger one, holding on with surprising strength. Thank you, he said simply. But Martha could hear all that remained unspoken in those two words: acknowledgement of what she was offering, appreciation for the trust it represented, and perhaps something more. The moment was interrupted by the sound of an approaching wagon. Abigail returning from town, Martha assumed. But as the vehicle came into view, she saw it was Samuel Holloway driving with Ezra Sullivan beside him. They pulled up to the hitching post, both men looking unusually excited as they climbed down from the wagon seat. Martha, Samuel called, removing his hat as he approached the porch. We have news. He stopped short when he saw Hope in Martha's arms. Oh, I didn't realize. That is congratulations. When did? A week ago, Martha supplied, smiling at his flustered reaction. This is Hope Coleman. Ezra stepped forward, his weathered face softening as he looked at the infant. She's beautiful, Martha. Thomas would have been so proud. Thank you, Martha said, the familiar pang of Thomas's absence tempered now by the joy of Hope's presence. What news brings you out here in such a hurry? Samuel and Ezra exchanged glances, their excitement returning. Two things, Samuel said. First, it's official. The town council voted unanimously to change the name to Coleman Spring. The paperwork has been sent to the territorial government for approval. Martha felt a surge of emotion at this confirmation of the rumor Abigail had shared. Thomas would have been honored, she said softly. And pleased, Ezra added. It's fitting that his discovery will be remembered. Samuel adjusted his spectacles, his expression becoming more serious. The second piece of news concerns Carter Reynolds. The judge has set a trial date 3 weeks from now. The prosecutor believes the case is strong, especially with Clayton's confession and James Butler's testimony. What will happen to the Double R Ranch? Martha asked. It was a question that had been on her mind frequently since Clayton's death. The future of the valley was tied to the fate of its largest property. That's being sorted out through the courts, Samuel explained. There are valid claims from several families whose land was fraudulently acquired. The bank has an interest as well, due to outstanding loans. The most likely outcome, Ezra interjected, is that the ranch will be broken up. The legitimate portions may be sold to pay debts, while the fraudulently acquired sections will be returned to their rightful owners where possible. Martha nodded, considering the implications. The breaking up of the Reynolds empire would fundamentally change the power dynamics in the valley, likely for the better, as no single entity would have the overwhelming influence Clayton had wielded. And the water rights? Swift Shadow asked, speaking for the first time since the men had arrived. Samuel turned to him, his manner respectful. That's still being determined. But Martha's discovery of the aquifer and her willingness to share access has changed the equation. The territorial governor has expressed interest in establishing a new model for water management in the region. This was welcome news. Martha had worried that her approach to sharing the water might be challenged by larger interests once word of the aquifer's extent spread beyond the valley. When will we know more? She asked. The governor is sending a representative next month, Samuel told her. He wants to see the spring and discuss your water sharing agreement. There's talk of using it as a template for other areas facing similar challenges. The conversation continued as Ezra and Samuel shared more details about developments in town and the broader territory. Martha listened with interest but found her attention divided between their news and the small miracle in her arms. Hope had fallen asleep again, her tiny face peaceful, one hand still wrapped tightly around Swift Shadow's finger. It was a striking image, the hardened warrior bound by the grip of a newborn, neither seeming inclined to break the connection. Martha felt something shift within her heart, a recognition of possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider until now. Later that evening, after Ezra and Samuel had departed and Abigail had returned from town, Martha found herself alone with Swift Shadow once more. Hope was sleeping in her cradle, that the house was quiet, and the New Mexico night spread its starry canopy overhead as they sat together on the porch. "What are you thinking?" Martha asked, noticing the contemplative expression on Swift Shadow's face as he gazed toward the distant mountains. He was silent for a moment as if considering how much to share. "I'm thinking of paths," he said finally, "how they wind and cross, sometimes bringing together those who began their journeys far apart." Martha nodded, understanding the metaphor. "Like a creek finding its way across the land." "Yes." Swift Shadow turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "Water follows the path of least resistance, but in doing so it shapes the very land it traverses. It changes and is changed by the journey." Martha felt the weight of what remained unspoken between them. "Swift Shadow," she began carefully, "when you told Running Fox you had found your path here, what did you mean exactly?" He held her gaze steadily. "I meant that I have found purpose here. Peace, perhaps. A place where my skills and knowledge have value beyond war or survival." "And is that enough?" Martha asked softly. "Purpose alone?" Swift Shadow's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "No," he admitted, "not alone." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Martha was acutely aware of his presence beside her, his strength, his quiet dignity, the complex man beneath the stoic exterior. "I still grieve for Thomas," she said, feeling the need to acknowledge this truth. "Part of me always will." Swift Shadow nodded. "As it should be. He was worthy of such remembrance." "But hope needs a father," Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I need more than memories to build a future on." Swift Shadow was very still, his gaze never leaving hers. "What are you saying, Martha Coleman?" Martha took a deep breath, finding courage in the certainty that had been growing within her. "I'm saying that I want you to stay. Not just as a protector or a friend, but as—" She hesitated, then finished, "as family. For hope. For me." For a long moment, Swift Shadow didn't respond. Then with deliberate care, he reached out and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, the touch gentle, but sure. "I would be honored," he said simply. But in his eyes, Martha could see all that those few words contained: commitment, respect, and a depth of feeling that needed no elaborate declaration. They sat together in the quietness of the New Mexico night, hands joined, the future opening before them, like the land at dawn. Inside the house, Hope slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge, even before consciousness, that she was protected, cherished, loved. And beneath the earth, the ancient waters continued their flow, nurturing the land that had become a symbol of both struggle and renewal. Coleman's Spring, a place where the past and future met, where different worlds converged, and where a family forged by both blood and choice had found its home. The journey ahead would not be without challenges. There would be those who disapproved of their unconventional family, who could not see beyond differences of background and culture. The legal battles over land and water rights would continue. Hope would grow up in a world of rapid change as the territory moved towards statehood, and the old ways gave way to the new. But for tonight, in this moment of quiet connection, Martha Coleman knew with certainty that they would face whatever came together. The promise Swift Shadow had made to Thomas had evolved into something deeper, something that belonged not to the past, but to the future. Water in a dry land, life where there had been emptiness, hope born of struggle. Some promises once made reshaped the very landscape of existence. In the end, perhaps that was Thomas's true legacy, not just the discovery of water beneath the earth, but the bringing together of lives that might otherwise never have connected. Martha squeezed Swift Shadow's hand, gently feeling his answering pressure. Words seemed unnecessary, inadequate, even in the face of what was growing between them, a bond as elemental and sustaining as the water that now flowed through the once dry creek bed. "The land remembers those who honor it," Running Fox had said, "and those who protect its guardians." In the quiet of the New Mexico night, under a canopy of stars that had witnessed countless human stories unfold beneath their ageless light, Martha Coleman and Swift Shadow began to write a new chapter in the ongoing story of the land, a story of water and hope, of promises kept and new beginnings. And somewhere perhaps Thomas Coleman knew and smiled. End of part 2. "Father sad?" she asked, her dark eyes so like Thomas's, solemn with concern. Swift Shadow gathered her close, his expression softening, as it always did with hope. "Not sad, little cricket, just thinking hard." Hope seemed to accept this explanation, settling against his chest with the complete trust of a child who has never known anything but security and love. Martha watched them together, her heart full, despite the worry of the moment. Whatever came, they would face it as a family. The sound of approaching horses brought them all to alert. Samuel moved to the window, peering out cautiously. Military, he confirmed. 4 riders, an officer, and 3 enlisted men, judging by the uniforms. Martha and Swift Shadow exchanged glances. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for since Samuel's warning. "I'll take Hope to the back room," Abigail offered, reaching for the child. Swift Shadow shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "She stays with us. We face this as a family." Martha nodded her agreement, moving to stand beside her husband as he rose with Hope still in his arms. The little girl, sensing the importance of the moment, remained unusually quiet, her small arms wrapped securely around Swift Shadow's neck. They stepped onto the porch just as the soldiers reined in their horses at the front gate. The officer, Lieutenant Martha noted, surveyed the property with obvious curiosity before dismounting. He was young, perhaps 25, with the stiff posture and slightly uncertain authority of a recent appointment. "Mrs. Coleman," he called, approaching the porch and removing his hat with formal courtesy. Then his gaze shifted to Swift Shadow, and his expression hardened slightly. And this would be the Apache known as Swift Shadow. "This is my husband," Martha corrected firmly. "Joseph Swift Shadow Coleman, co-owner of this ranch and father to our daughter." The lieutenant seemed momentarily taken aback by her directness. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant James Wilson, under orders from Major Harrison at Fort Stanton. I'm here to inform you of new regulations regarding Apache movement in the territory." "We're aware of the regulations, Lieutenant," Martha replied coolly, "and we're also aware that they're being protested at the highest levels of territorial government." Wilson's composure slipped slightly. "Be that as it may, ma'am, the orders stand until countermanded. No Apache is to travel outside designated areas without written permission from military authorities." Swift Shadow spoke for the first time, his voice level, but carrying an undercurrent of authority that made the young officer straighten involuntarily. "This is my home, Lieutenant, my legal residence registered with the Territorial Land Office. I have no intention of seeking permission to live on my own property." "The regulations," Wilson began, "do not supersede established property rights," Samuel interjected, stepping forward with the confidence of his banking position. "Mr. Coleman is a legal landowner with documentation filed at both the Territorial Land Office and First Bank of Coleman Spring." The lieutenant's gaze shifted between them, the conflict within him visible. He was following orders, but clearly hadn't expected such a unified and legally informed resistance. "Additionally," Martha continued, pressing their advantage, "this ranch supplies water to the entire valley through an agreement formally recognized by the territorial governor. Any disruption to its operation would have significant consequences." Hope, who had been watching the exchange with solemn attention, chose this moment to speak. "Father stays," she announced with the absolute certainty of a 2-year-old. "This is home." A flicker of something discomfort, perhaps, or even shame crossed Lieutenant Wilson's face. He was young enough that the sight of a small child clinging to her father still affected him, regardless of that father's race. "I have my orders," he said, though with less conviction than before. "All Apache must be registered and accounted for." "Then register me here," Swift Shadow said calmly, "at my home with my family. I have no objection to being accounted for, Lieutenant, only to being treated as less than a citizen on my own land." This reasonable compromise seemed to offer Wilson a way out of his increasingly awkward position. "That would be acceptable," he conceded, "for now, pending further instructions from Fort Stanton." The tension eased perceptibly as the lieutenant produced a ledger and recorded Swift Shadow's information: name, location, family status. Throughout the process, Swift Shadow maintained his dignity, answering questions clearly, while continuing to hold Hope, whose presence served as a constant reminder of what was truly at stake. When the formalities were complete, Wilson replaced his hat, his manner now more awkward than authoritative. "I'll inform Major Harrison that you've been documented at your legal residence," he said. "But I should warn you, he's determined to enforce these regulations strictly. It would be advisable to limit your movements to the ranch property for the time being." "Thank you for the warning, Lieutenant," Martha replied, her tone making it clear that the interview was concluded. As the soldiers rode away, Martha felt a complex mixture of relief and simmering anger. They had averted an immediate crisis, but the underlying problem remained. Swift Shadow's freedom, his very citizenship, was being questioned based solely on his Apache heritage. "This isn't over," she said quietly as they watched the dust settle behind the departing riders. Swift Shadow nodded, his expression thoughtful as he set Hope down to play on the porch. "No," he agreed, "but we have time now. Time to act rather than merely react." Samuel adjusted his spectacles, his expression determined. "I'll send a telegram to the governor's office today, in addition to the town council's formal protest. This overreach by the military needs to be addressed immediately." Martha appreciated his support, but knew that official channels might move too slowly. "We need to do more," she said. "Rally the community, show that Swift Shadow isn't isolated or vulnerable." As they discussed strategies, Abigail emerged from the house with a tray of coffee and her freshly baked cornbread. "Politics goes better with food," she declared, setting the tray on the porch table. "Sit down, all of you. The soldiers are gone for now, and you need to keep your strength." The simple, practical gesture brought a welcome return to normalcy. They settled around the table, Hope climbing into her special chair, the conversation shifting to immediate plans rather than abstract concerns. "The water delegation from Santa Fe arrives tomorrow," Samuel reminded them as he helped himself to cornbread. "That's good timing. Having territorial officials here will provide additional protection." "And a chance to make our case directly," Martha agreed, her mind already turning over possibilities. "If the governor's representatives see firsthand how essential Swift Shadow is to the ranch's operation and the water management system, they might intervene with the military," Swift Shadow finished her thought, "at least to create an exception for those with established residence and property." As they continued planning, Martha observed her husband carefully. Despite his outward calm, she could see the tension he carried in the set of his shoulders, the watchfulness that had intensified in his gaze. This situation had reopened old wounds, reminding him of the Army's betrayals years ago, of the loss of his first family, of his people's ongoing struggle for basic rights. Later that evening, after Hope had been put to bed and Samuel had returned to town with promises of further support, Martha found Swift Shadow at their favorite spot by the creek. The water flowed steadily in the moonlight, its surface occasionally dimpled by rising fish or skimming insects. "You're worried about Running Fox and the others," she said, not a question, but an observation as she settled beside him on the creek bank. Swift Shadow nodded, his gaze on the flowing water. "They are more vulnerable than I am. They have no white wife, no legal property, no bank accounts or water rights to protect them." The blunt assessment was typical of his directness, without self-pity or resentment. It was simply the truth as he saw it. Martha took his hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of physical work. "We'll find a way to protect them too," she promised. "This land, this community, was built on shared resources and mutual support. We won't abandon those principles now." Swift Shadow's fingers tightened around hers. "You have a warrior's heart, Martha Coleman," he said, a rare warmth coloring his voice. "It is one of the many reasons I love you." The simple declaration, all the more powerful for its infrequency, touched Martha deeply. Swift Shadow was not a man given to effusive expressions of emotion, but when he did speak of feelings, his words carried the weight of absolute sincerity. "We've faced worse and prevailed," she reminded him, leaning against his shoulder. "Clayton Reynolds' drought, childbirth, building a new life from ashes. This is just another challenge on our path." Swift Shadow's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "Yes," he agreed, "another bend in the river, not its end." They sat together in the peaceful night, drawing strength from each other and from the land that had brought them together. The water continued its eternal flow, a reminder of continuity amidst change, of resilience in the face of adversity. Whatever came next, military overreach, community prejudice, the ongoing challenges of building a cross-cultural family, they would face it together with the same determination that had carried them through the trials of the past. The promised land beside the Rio had yielded not just water, but wisdom, that true strength comes from connection, that love transcends boundaries, and that the future belongs to those with the courage to imagine it differently than the past. The following days brought a flurry of activity to the Coleman Ranch. The water delegation from Santa Fe arrived as scheduled, three serious men in formal attire, looking somewhat out of place in the rural setting, but impressively thorough in their examination of the spring and water distribution system. Martha and Swift Shadow guided them through every aspect of the operation, from the original discovery at the mission ruins to the irrigation channels now serving multiple properties throughout the valley. Swift Shadow's expertise was particularly evident as he explained the traditional water conservation techniques he had incorporated into the modern system. Remarkable, commented Harold Davis, the senior delegate and a direct representative of the territorial governor. You've created something truly innovative here, a blend of native wisdom and modern engineering. My husband deserves most of the credit for that aspect. Martha replied, her emphasis on the word husband, subtle but deliberate. His knowledge of traditional Apache water management has proven invaluable. Davis nodded, clearly impressed. When the tour concluded at the main house where Abigail had prepared refreshments, the delegates settled on the porch for more formal discussions. Hope, fascinated by the visitors, stationed herself on Swift Shadow's lap, occasionally contributing her 2-year-old's perspective on the importance of water. River brings life, she announced solemnly during a pause in the conversation. Father says so. Davis smiled at the child, then glanced at Swift Shadow with renewed interest. Your daughter is being well educated in conservation principles, he observed. She learns from both her heritages, Swift Shadow replied, the wisdom of her mother's people and of mine. The opening was perfect, and Martha took it without hesitation. Which is why we're deeply concerned about the military's new restrictions on Apache movement. She said, her voice calm but firm. My husband is a legal property owner and essential to this operation, yet he's now required to register with Fort Stanton as if he were a potential threat. Davis's expression grew serious. Yes, we heard about Major Harrison's orders. Unfortunate business. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. The governor is already addressing the situation. Your husband's status here is not in question, Mrs. Coleman. The regulations were intended for reservation Apache, not established property owners. But they're being applied without distinction, Swift Shadow pointed out, and they affect my people beyond this ranch, including those who help maintain the water system that serves the entire valley. Davis exchanged glances with his colleagues. You make an excellent point, Mr. Coleman. The water management system here has been highlighted as a model for the territory. Any disruption to its operation would be problematic. The conversation continued in this vein with Martha Bush and Swift Shadow, carefully making their case not just for their own situation, but for a more reasonable approach to Apache settler relations throughout the region. By the time the delegation departed, Davis had promised to raise these concerns directly with the governor and to send a formal communication to Fort Stanton regarding the importance of the Coleman Ranch operation. That went well, Martha observed as they watched the delegate's wagon disappear down the road toward town. Swift Shadow nodded, though his expression remained cautious. Words are easy, he said. Action, less so. Davis seems sincere, Martha countered, and he clearly values what we've built here. Yes, Swift Shadow agreed, but he answers to many voices, not just ours. He glanced toward the distant mountains where Running Fox and his band made their home. And my people have heard promises before. Martha couldn't argue with this hard-earned skepticism. History had given the Apache ample reason to distrust government assurances. Then we'll keep working on multiple fronts, she said practically. Official channels through Davis and the governor community support through the town council and direct outreach to the new commander at Fort Stanton. Swift Shadow's expression softened slightly. Always the strategist, he observed, a hint of admiration in his voice. I learned from the best, Martha replied with a small smile. A certain Apache warrior taught me the value of seeing all paths forward. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider from town, one of the young men who worked at the telegraph office, pushing his horse to a pace that suggested urgent news. Mrs. Coleman, Mr. Coleman, he called as he approached. Message from Santa Fe. Martha and Swift Shadow exchanged glances, then moved to meet the messenger as he reined in his lathered horse at their gate. What is it, Billy? Martha asked, recognizing the youth who had often delivered telegrams to the ranch. Governor's office, Billy panted, handing over a sealed envelope. Said it was urgent. Came in right after Mr. Davis and them left town. Martha broke the seal, unfolding the single page within. Swift Shadow read over her shoulder, his expression giving away nothing of his reaction to the contents. Thank you, Billy, Martha said when she had finished reading. Please tell Mr. Hayes at the telegraph office that we'll respond tomorrow after we've had time to consider. Once the messenger had departed, Martha reread the telegram, her mind working through the implications of its terse sentences. "The governor wants you to serve on a territorial commission," she said, though Swift Shadow had already read the invitation himself. "A formal advisory role on water rights in Apache settler relations." Swift Shadow was silent for a moment, his dark eyes focused on some distant point as he considered the question. "I believe it is a risk worth taking," he said finally. "A chance to speak for those who have been silenced too long. But also," his gaze returned to Martha, softening as it always did when he looked at her or Hope, "a way to secure our family's future, to build a world where our daughter can live proudly with all aspects of her heritage." Martha finished tending his wound, her heart full with love, and pride for this man who continually balanced his responsibilities to his people with his commitment to their family. "Then you should accept," she said, her voice firm with conviction, "and I'll be beside you every step of the way." Swift Shadow reached out with his uninjured arm, drawing her close. "I never doubted it," he murmured against her hair. They were interrupted by the sound of small running feet. Hope, awake earlier than usual, appeared in the kitchen doorway, her eyes widening with delight at the sight of her father. "Father, home!" she exclaimed, launching herself towards Swift Shadow with complete confidence that he would catch her despite his injury. Swift Shadow winced slightly as he gathered her up with his good arm, but his smile was genuine. "Yes, little cricket, I am home." Hope immediately noticed the bandage. Her small fingers hovered over it without touching, her expression solemn. "Hurt. A scratch," Swift Shadow assured her. "Already healing." Hope considered this with the serious contemplation that characterized her approach to the world. Then she leaned forward and gently kissed the bandage. "Better now," she declared. The simple gesture, so full of innocent faith and love, brought tears to Martha's eyes. This was what they were fighting for, not just water rights or legal recognition, but the future embodied in this small person who moved between worlds with natural grace, seeing no contradiction in her blended heritage. Later that morning, after Hope had been fed and was playing contentedly under Abigail's watchful eye, Martha and Swift Shadow drafted their response to the governor's office. They accepted the commission appointment, but included conditions that Swift Shadow and Running Fox had determined were essential, guaranteed safe passage for Apache representatives attending water management meetings, formal recognition of traditional water rights, and inclusion of Native voices in all decisions affecting ancestral lands. Samuel, who had been relieved and delighted by Swift Shadow's safe return, offered to deliver the response personally to the telegraph office in town. "And I'll speak with the town council about the shooting incident," he added, his youthful face hardening with unusual determination. "Major Harrison needs to understand that firing on a respected community member will not be tolerated." After Samuel departed, Martha and Swift Shadow took time to simply be together as a family. Despite the lingering tension of recent events, there was a sense of possibility in the air, a feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, the path forward was beginning to open before them. That afternoon, as they sat together by the creek, Hope playing nearby with the serious concentration she brought to all her endeavors, Swift Shadow spoke of his journey in more detail than he had shared earlier. "The patrol that fired at me," he said quietly, ensuring Hope was out of earshot. "They were young, inexperienced, afraid of shadows and stories they had been told about savage Apaches. They shot without identifying their target, without warning." Martha's hand tightened on his. "You could have been killed." "Yes," he acknowledged, "but that is not the point I wish to make." His gaze followed Hope as she carefully arranged stones along the creek bank. "The point is that fear ignorance is the true enemy, not individuals in uniform." Martha considered this. It was typical of Swift Shadow to look beyond the immediate threat to the deeper patterns beneath. "And you believe the commission can help address that fear, that ignorance?" "Perhaps," he said, "not quickly, not easily, but water teaches patience, does it not, flowing year after year, gradually reshaping even the hardest stone." Martha smiled at the metaphor, so characteristic of his way of thinking. "You're right, of course. Change takes time." She looked at their daughter, now totally absorbed in her stone arrangements. "But hope gives us reason to pursue it, however long it takes." Swift Shadow nodded, his expression softening, as it always did when he watched Hope. "She is the future," he said simply, "a future worth fighting for." In the days that followed, events moved with surprising speed. The governor's office accepted Swift Shadow's conditions for the commission appointment, sending official documentation that effectively overrode Major Harrison's restrictions on Apache movement. Lieutenant Wilson himself delivered the papers to the ranch, his manner considerably more respectful than during his previous visit. "The governor sends his personal regards," the young officer told them stiffly, "and Major Harrison extends his apologies for the incident with the patrol. The soldiers involved have been disciplined." Martha, standing beside Swift Shadow on the porch, maintained her diplomatic smile, despite her private opinion that an apology hardly compensated for nearly killing her husband. "Please convey our appreciation to Major Harrison," she replied, her tone pleasant but cool. "We look forward to more productive relations between Fort Stanton and the community in the future." After the lieutenant departed, Swift Shadow raised an eyebrow at Martha's restrained response. "Diplomatic as always." He observed a hint of amusement in his voice. Martha's composure dissolved into a more genuine expression. "I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of their apology," she admitted. "But that wouldn't have helped matters." "No," Swift Shadow agreed. "Sometimes the water must flow around the obstacle rather than trying to break it immediately." The commission appointment brought significant changes to their lives. Swift Shadow began traveling regularly to Santa Fe for meetings, sometimes accompanied by Martha when hope could be left in Abigail's capable care. As Swift Shadow had suggested, Windrunner joined the ranch operation, bringing his considerable skills and serving as an important link between the Coleman household and the Apache community in the mountains. The work was challenging but rewarding. Swift Shadow's presence on the commission, the first Apache to serve in such a capacity in the territory, initially met with resistance from some quarters. But his quiet authority, deep knowledge, and practical approach gradually earned a respect even from those who had been skeptical. Martha found her own role evolving as well. Her experience with the water-sharing agreement made her a valuable contributor to discussions about resource management throughout the territory. Together, she and Swift Shadow became known as effective advocates for collaborative approaches that respected both settler needs and native traditions. One autumn evening, as they returned from a particularly productive series of meetings in Santa Fe, Martha and Swift Shadow paused at the rise overlooking their ranch. The setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light, highlighting the flowing creek, the productive fields, and the modest but well-maintained buildings that constituted their home. In the yard, they could see Hope, now nearly 3 years old, playing with Windrunner's warriors, the two children engaged in some elaborate game that involved much running and laughter. Abigail watched from the porch, her weathered face softened by the smile that Hope always seemed to evoke. "It's remarkable," Martha said softly, "how much has changed in just a few years." Swift Shadow nodded his gaze, taking in the peaceful scene below. "The land remembers," he said, echoing one of Running Fox's favorite sayings. "It remembers those who honor it, who protect its waters, who build with respect rather than only taking." Martha leaned against him slightly, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Do you ever wonder what Thomas would think of all this?" "Of us?" Swift Shadow was silent for a moment, considering the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "I believe he would be pleased," he said finally. "His vision for the land has been fulfilled. His daughter grows strong and happy. And you," he turned to look at Martha directly, "you have found a way forward that honors his memory while creating something new." Martha felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by the simple wisdom of his words. "Yes," she agreed, "that's exactly it." They rode down to the ranch together, welcomed enthusiastically by Hope, who had spotted their approach and raced to meet them. As Swift Shadow swung her up into his arms, her delighted laughter rising in the evening air, Martha felt a profound sense of rightness, of having found her place in a story larger than herself. The promised land beside the Rio had yielded more than water, more than sustenance for crops and livestock. It had yielded home in the deepest sense, a place of belonging, of purpose, of love that transcended boundaries and expectations. As they walked together toward the house, the small family unit surrounded by the land they had helped to heal, Martha knew with absolute certainty that all of this was Thomas's true legacy. Not just the discovery of water beneath the earth, but the connections that had formed above it, the community that had grown from shared need and mutual respect, the future that was taking shape in their daughter's bright eyes and curious mind. Water in a dry land, hope born of struggle, a family forged through choice and commitment rather than merely blood. Some stories, Martha reflected, didn't end so much as flow into larger narratives like streams joining a river on its journey to the sea. Her story, Thomas's story, Swift Shadow's story, Hope's story, all merging into something more powerful than any could have been alone. The sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Another day completed its cycle, water continued its eternal flow, and life went on changed by what had come before, but always moving forward, always seeking new channels, new possibilities. In the gathering twilight, Martha Coleman walked beside her husband, their daughter between them, toward the home they had built together on the promised land beside the Rio. And somewhere perhaps Thomas knew and smiled.